Hi guys and welcome to Boring History Relaxing. Tonight we step quietly into the year 1620. You find yourself standing on the cold edge of a distant continent, the wooden deck of a small ship rocking gently behind you. The wind carries the scent of salt and pine across the unfamiliar shoreline. In front of you stretches a vast forest that seems to go on forever, dark and patient, as if it has been waiting centuries for you to arrive. You probably imagine adventure, perhaps opportunity, maybe even the beginning of a brave new world. But before we go any further, let me gently warn you about something. You probably will not survive this. Not comfortably. Horribly. Life in America in 1620 is not the hopeful painting many people picture in school textbooks. It is muddy, uncertain, exhausting, and frequently terrifying. The land is beautiful, yes, but beauty does not always equal kindness. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you settle in, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight. Leave a comment with your location and your local time. Somewhere out there, someone else is probably falling asleep to the same quiet history story. Now dim the lights. The wooden hull of the ship creaks softly behind you as the wind shifts across the water. The long Atlantic journey has finally ended. Weeks of cold waves, damp clothes, and cramped sleeping spaces have brought you here to the shoreline of a place the settlers call New England. You step carefully onto the sand, your boots sinking slightly into the wet ground. The first thing you notice is how quiet everything feels. In Europe, even the countryside carries distant sounds. A church bell somewhere, a wagon rumbling down a road, a dog barking behind a farmhouse wall. Here there is none of that. Only wind through tall pine trees and the steady movement of the ocean behind you. One well-known historical detail often surprises people. When the English settlers arrived in this region in 1620, they were not stepping into completely untouched wilderness. This land had already been home to native societies for thousands of years. Villages, trade routes, and cultivated fields once filled parts of this coastline. In fact, some historians believe the specific area chosen for settlement may have recently been cleared by native community before a devastating epidemic spread through the region just a few years earlier. Entire villages were left empty. Fields returned slowly to grass and forest. So when you stand here now, looking at the open land and scattered clearings, it might seem like empty wilderness. But in truth, you are walking through the echoes of another world. The wind moves gently through tall grass near the shoreline. Behind you, the ship waits quietly at anchor, its sails lowered after the long crossing from England. Life aboard that ship was not exactly comfortable either. A strange little historical curiosity often mentioned in letters from the time describes how passengers sometimes slept in spaces barely tall enough to sit upright. Many shared cramped compartments below deck that smelled constantly of wet wood salt and unwashed clothing. Privacy was almost non-existent. After 2 months of that environment, the open air of the coast probably feels wonderful. Still, comfort will not last long. You look toward the forest again. Tall trees rise close together, their branches swaying slowly in the cool autumn wind. Sunlight filters through the leaves in narrow beams that reach the forest floor. The shadows beneath them look deep and mysterious. This forest holds animals you may have never seen before. Wolves move silently through these woods. Black bears wander along streams searching for food. And somewhere deeper in the land, mountain lions watch quietly from rocky ridges. Of course, animals are not the only unknowns here. One question scholars continue to debate concerns how aware the settlers truly were of the native communities surrounding them. Some researchers believe the newcomers arrived expecting contact almost immediately. Others think they were surprised by how quiet the region initially appeared. Standing here now, you can easily imagine how uncertain everything must feel. A few other settlers move slowly along the beach behind you. They speak quietly, pointing toward the forest, discussing where homes might be built. Their clothing is thick wool, simple hats and heavy cloaks that protect against the cool coastal wind. None of it looks like the shiny black outfits often shown in cartoons. Real clothing in 1620 is far more practical. Browns, greys, and faded colours dominate. Fabrics are rough and durable rather than elegant. You take a few steps inland, the ground rises gently from the beach toward a patch of open land. Grass grows here in soft waves, broken occasionally by clusters of small shrubs. It looks like a reasonable place to begin building. Soon the sound of axes will fill this quiet space. Trees will fall. Logs will be dragged across the ground. Small wooden houses will slowly appear. But right now, none of that has happened yet. The settlement does not exist. There are no streets, no farms, no fences, only a handful of uncertain people standing at the edge of a continent. You feel the cold wind again brushing against your coat. Autumn is already deep in New England. Leaves flutter down from the branches above you, drifting across the ground in soft spirals. Winter is coming, and winter here will not be gentle. Many settlers do not yet understand how harsh the cold season in this region can be. Snow will pile deep across the land, rivers will freeze, food supplies will run dangerously low. Some people standing beside you on this shoreline will not live to see the following spring. Yet at this moment, hope still hangs quietly in the air. The settlers speak of fresh beginnings. They imagine farms stretching across the open land. They picture small villages growing into towns. And perhaps most comforting of all, they imagine stability. A place where families might build lives far from the struggles they left behind in England. You walk slowly toward the edge of the clearing. From here you can see the forest more clearly. Tall trunks rise like pillars in a vast green cathedral. The ground beneath them is soft with fallen leaves and pine needles. A faint animal track winds between the trees. You pause. Somewhere deeper inside the woods a bird calls. Then silence returns again. Life in America in 1620 begins exactly like this. Quiet, uncertain, and balanced delicately between hope and danger. Soon axes will swing, houses will rise, fires will burn through long winter nights. But for now, you simply stand here breathing the cold air of a new world, listening to the forest and the distant creak of the ship behind you. The story has only just begun. The next morning arrives quietly carried in on a pale grey light that slips through the thin clouds above the coastline. The ocean behind you moves slowly against the shore, steady and patient, as if it has watched many groups of hopeful newcomers arrive here before. You wake stiff from the cold. Your sleeping place last night was not exactly luxurious. A blanket spread across rough ground near a small fire does not offer much comfort. The air during the night grew damp and heavy, and by morning your clothes feel slightly chilled with moisture. Still, the sky is clear enough to begin work. There is no real choice about that. Survival here depends on road speed. You stand and stretch, slowly feeling the ache in your shoulders from yesterday's long journey and restless sleep. Around you other settlers begin to stir. Some cough softly. Others pull their coats tighter around themselves while they step closer to the fire. Breakfast is simple. A small portion of dried food from the ship, perhaps a little salted meat or hard biscuit that requires patient chewing. The biscuit is so dense that it feels more like stone than bread. It is not delicious, but it is energy, and right now energy is precious. One widely accepted historical detail tells us that the Plymouth settlers arrived late in the year, in November of 1620. This timing made their situation extremely difficult. There was almost no time to build proper shelter or grow crops before winter arrived. In other words, the clock was already ticking. You walk a short distance toward the edge of the forest where several men are already examining the trees. They speak quietly while pointing upward at thick trunks of oak and pine. These trees will soon become houses, but first they must fall. The first swing of an axe sounds sharp in the quiet morning air, then another. The rhythm builds slowly, metal biting into wood, chips flying across the ground. The forest that once stood untouched now begins to echo with human effort. If you have never cut down a tree using 17th century tools, you might imagine it takes a few minutes. In reality, it takes hours. The axes are strong but heavy. Each swing requires full strength. The tree does not cooperate. It stands firm, absorbing blow after blow while wood fibers slowly begin to weaken. You watch as two men work together on the same trunk. Their breath forms pale clouds in the cold air. Sweat appears on their foreheads even though the day remains cool. A curious little historical detail often surprises people. Early colonial settlements frequently used palisade defences around their villages. These were tall wooden walls built from sharpened logs placed tightly together. The purpose was simple: protection. No one here fully understands what dangers might appear from the surrounding wilderness, or from potential conflicts with unfamiliar neighbours. So as the first trees fall, some of the logs will become houses, others will become walls. You kneel near a fallen trunk while someone begins removing branches with a smaller axe. The fresh scent of pine fills the air. Sap glistens along the exposed wood where the bark has been split. The smell is surprisingly pleasant. Wood smoke soon joins it as the morning fire continues burning near the campsite. For a moment you pause and look around. Yesterday this clearing held only grass and wind. Today it holds activity. People move back and forth carrying tools. Voices call out instructions. Someone drags a long branch across the ground, leaving a rough trail in the soil. The settlement is beginning, slowly, painfully, but unmistakably. One question historians still discuss concerns exactly how quickly the first homes were completed. Some written records suggest the settlers built simple communal structures at first. Others believe small family houses appeared sooner than previously thought. Either way, none of these buildings would have looked impressive. Picture something closer to a rough wooden cabin than a tidy village house. Logs stacked together, gaps filled with mud and clay, roofs covered with thatch or wooden shingles, and inside very little furniture. Still, even a simple shelter means protection from wind, rain and snow, which is more valuable than elegance. The sun climbs higher above the trees as the morning continues. Light spreads across the clearing, revealing patches of disturbed earth, where tree roots once held the soil together. Birds circle overhead, curious about the sudden human activity. Some settlers move down toward the shoreline where small boats carry supplies from the ship. Barrels, tools, blankets, and food must all be transported before storms make the water dangerous. You decide to follow them. The path toward the water slopes gently downward through grass that bends softly under your boots. The ocean looks calmer today than it did during the long voyage across the Atlantic, but it still carries that deep, endless feeling. A ship floating just offshore reminds you how far from home everyone here truly is. Another strange historical tidbit appears in journals from early colonists. Some settlers brought surprisingly ordinary household items across the ocean. Things like small mirrors, writing desks, or even decorative plates. Objects meant for a comfortable life. Objects that now seem slightly out of place in this rugged environment. It's difficult to imagine polishing a silver plate while wolves roam the forest nearby. Still, people carry pieces of their old lives with them. Perhaps it helps them believe the new life will eventually resemble the one they left behind. You help roll a barrel onto the sand where several others wait to carry it inland. The wood feels heavy beneath your hands. Inside may be food or tools, or maybe precious gunpowder needed for hunting. Everything here matters. Nothing can be wasted. As you push the barrel along the beach, a cold wind sweeps across the water again. The air smells of salt and distant storms. Waves break gently along the shoreline with a slow, steady rhythm. For a moment, the sound almost feels peaceful. But peace in 1620 is temporary. The settlement still has no permanent homes. Winter still approaches, and the forest still watches quietly from the edge of the clearing. When you return inland again, more trees have fallen. Fresh stumps rise from the earth like rough wooden stools. Piles of branches lie scattered across the ground, waiting to be burned or shaped into useful pieces. The colony is beginning to take form. Not yet a town, not even a village. Someone had to bore. But a fragile footprint pressed into the edge of a continent. And as the afternoon light begins to soften across the clearing, you realize something important. The forest may be vast, the ocean may be endless, but this small group of tired settlers has decided to stay. And tomorrow the sound of axes will begin again. Morning work continues for several days in the same steady rhythm. Axes rise and fall, logs are dragged across the clearing, and the small camp slowly begins to resemble something that might eventually become a settlement. Yet even as the effort continues, the air grows steadily colder. You begin to notice it in the mornings first. When you wake, the ground feels stiff beneath your blanket. A thin crust of frost sometimes glitters across the grass. Your breath appears in small, pale clouds when you exhale. Winter is approaching faster than many people expected. You walk toward the half-finished structure rising near the center of the clearing. It is not yet a proper house, more like a rough wooden frame built from thick logs stacked carefully together. Mud has been pressed into the gaps between the logs to block the wind. Inside, the space is dark but slightly warmer than the open air. A small fire pit has been prepared in the center of the floor. Smoke will eventually escape through a hole cut into the roof. Until then, the inside smells strongly of fresh wood and damp earth. It's not luxurious, but it will be shelter. And shelter matters more with each passing day. A commonly accepted historical fact explains that the first winter for the Plymouth settlers was devastating. Roughly half of the colonists died during those early months due to cold illness and hunger. It was one of the most difficult beginnings any English colony experienced in North America. Standing here now, watching people work with quiet determination, it is difficult to imagine that so many will soon be gone. For the moment, hope still guides every movement. You step back outside where several settlers are gathering fallen branches into a large pile. Firewood must be collected constantly. Without it, the cold nights would quickly become unbearable. The forest nearby provides plenty of wood. The problem is time. Each tree requires hours to cut and prepare, and daylight during late autumn grows shorter every week. The sun now travels low across the sky, leaving long shadows stretching across the clearing even in early afternoon. A chilly wind moves through the tall grass. It carries with it the distant smell of the sea mixed with the sharper scent of pine from the forest. The sound of hammering drifts through the air. Someone has begun fastening wooden planks across a roof frame. You walk over to watch. Two men balance carefully on a ladder made from rough branches tied together with rope. They place each plank, slowly securing it with wooden pegs hammered through drilled holes. Metal nails are precious and must be used sparingly. The process moves slowly but steadily. Below them, another group prepares clay and soil to seal the outer walls of the structure. They mix the mud with straw to create a thicker material that will help block wind and rain. The texture feels heavy and cold in your hands when you try lifting a small portion. Someone laughs quietly when a clump slides off your fingers and lands in the dirt. Small moments like this matter more than you might expect. Even in difficult conditions, people still find brief chances to smile. An unusual little historical curiosity appears in several accounts from early settlers. Some colonists describe the strange feeling of tidiness during their first winters in New England. Without the constant sounds of European villages, the quiet wilderness could feel almost unsettling. You begin to understand that feeling now. Beyond the clearing, the forest stands motionless. Sometimes a bird calls from high branches. Sometimes the wind rustles dry leaves across the ground. But otherwise, the land feels watchful and still. You wonder what lives deeper inside those woods. Deer, perhaps. Foxes. Wolves. One topic that researchers still debate concerns how frequently early settlers actually encountered dangerous wildlife. Popular stories often exaggerate constant attacks by wild animals. In reality, animals generally avoided human settlements unless food shortages forced them closer. Still, during long dark nights, imagination can easily turn every rustling leaf into something far more frightening. You help carry another bundle of branches toward the growing firewood pile. The weight presses against your arms as you walk. When the bundle finally drops to the ground, a soft puff of dry leaves rises into the cold air. Your hands feel numb. The wind has grown stronger during the afternoon, pushing grey clouds slowly across the sky. The ocean beyond the trees looks darker now, its surface rippling beneath the rising breeze. Someone nearby begins covering a stack of supplies with a heavy cloth to protect them from possible rain. Weather changes quickly along this coast. You move toward the fire where several settlers warm their hands. The flames crackle softly while thin ribbons of smoke drift upward into the cold sky. The heat feels wonderful. Your fingers slowly regain feeling as you hold them close to the warmth. Nearby, a small group discusses plans for the next structure. More shelter is urgently needed before winter storms arrive. Each family hopes for at least a simple roof over their heads before the worst cold begins, but there are not enough finished buildings yet. Some people will spend much of the winter living in crowded communal spaces. Others may still rely on the ship anchored offshore. Neither option is comfortable. As the afternoon fades, the sunlight turns pale and golden across the clearing. Long shadows stretch from the tree stumps scattered around the settlement. Work continues until the last possible moment. Axes swing, logs are rolled into position. Mud is pressed between wooden beams. The effort seems endless. Eventually the sun slips lower behind the forest. Cold air settles quickly across the land. One by one the workers step away from their tasks and gather near the fires. The day's progress is modest but meaningful. A few more walls stand upright. A roof frame has taken shape. Small steps forward. The wind whispers through the branches overhead as darkness begins to arrive. Tonight will be colder than the night before. You pull your coat tighter around your shoulders while watching sparks drift upward from the fire. Somewhere beyond the trees, a distant animal call echoes briefly through the forest before fading into silence. Winter is coming very soon now, and the small colony at the edge of the forest is not yet ready. But tomorrow morning, when the pale light returns again, the axes will rise once more. The next morning begins with a different kind of sound. Not axes, not hammering, but the low, uncomfortable rumble of hunger. You wake before sunrise, your stomach already reminding you that yesterday's food was not nearly enough. The cold seems sharper today as well, creeping into your clothes during the night and settling deep into your bones. The fire has burned down to glowing embers. Someone kneels beside it, carefully blowing on the coals until a thin orange glow spreads again. Small sticks are added, then thicker branches. Soon the quiet crackling of flames returns to the camp. Morning warmth arrives slowly. Breakfast, if it can truly be called, that is simple and small. A piece of hard biscuit, perhaps a small portion of dried peas soaked in water to soften them. Salted meat appears occasionally, though it must be rationed carefully. Food is already becoming a serious concern. One well-documented historical reality reveals that early colonial food supplies often ran dangerously low during the first winter. Many of the settlers had not yet established farms or reliable hunting patterns. Their survival depended heavily on what provisions remained from the ship and whatever could be gathered from the surrounding land. And the land, at least for now, is unfamiliar. You sit near the fire, chewing slowly. The biscuit takes patience. Each bite must be softened carefully before swallowing. Some settlers dip theirs into warm water or thin broth when available. It is not exactly breakfast the way you might imagine it today. No eggs sizzling in a pan, no bread fresh from an oven, just survival food. A small and slightly strange detail from colonial diaries mentions that these hardship biscuits sometimes contain tiny insects or larvae after long sea voyages. The sailors had a practical philosophy about this. Extra protein. You decide not to examine your biscuit too closely. The sky slowly brightens above the trees. Pale light spreads across the clearing as the camp begins stirring again, but the energy today feels slightly different. Less excitement, more quiet calculation. People are beginning to realize how precious every mouthful of food truly is. You stand and brush crumbs from your coat before walking toward the edge of the forest. Several men prepare muskets and simple hunting gear. Today, a small group will attempt to search the nearby woods for deer or wild turkey. Hunting here requires patience and luck. The forest is thick and unfamiliar. Animal trails twist through dense undergrowth where visibility disappears after just a few steps. A careless noise can send game running long before a hunter ever sees it. You follow quietly behind the group as they enter the trees. Immediately the world changes. Inside the forest, the air feels still and cool. Pine needles cover the ground, softening each footstep. Tall trunks rise above you, blocking much of the sky and creating long, dim corridors between branches. The smell here is earthy and damp. Somewhere in the distance, water trickles gently through a hidden stream. Everyone moves slowly. One hunter kneels beside the ground to examine faint tracks pressed into the mud. A deer passed through not long ago. The hoof marks are fresh enough to encourage quiet excitement among the group. Fresh meat would be a tremendous gift. You continue deeper into the forest, stepping carefully over fallen branches. Occasionally someone raises a hand to signal silence. Every ear listens for movement. But the woods remain calm. A soft wind moves high above the canopy. A crow calls once from a distant tree. Otherwise, only the slow rhythm of breathing and cautious footsteps fills the air. A curious little note from the early colonial accounts describes how settlers often underestimated the skill required to hunt in American forests. European hunting traditions usually involved open fields or managed estates where animals were easier to track. Here everything is wilder. Animals know these woods better than you ever will. This morning the deer remains invisible. After nearly 2 hours of quiet searching, the group finally pauses beside a narrow stream. Cold water flows gently over smooth stones clear enough to reveal the sandy bottom beneath. Someone kneels to drink. The water is shockingly cold but refreshing. You crouch beside this stream as well, splashing a little onto your face. The chill wakes you fully now, though the hunger in your stomach remains unchanged. Nearby, one of the hunters whispers softly, "A wild turkey has appeared farther upstream." Everyone freezes. The bird stands tall near the edge of the water, its dark feathers blending with the forest shadows. For several long seconds, it seems unaware of the human presence nearby. A musket is slowly raised. Carefully, quietly, the shot breaks the forest silence with a sudden thunderous crack. Birds burst upward from nearby trees. The smell of gunpowder drifts through the air. When the echo fades, the turkey lies still beside the stream. Relief spreads quickly through the group. It is not a large animal, but is food. Real food. You help carry the bird back toward the settlement, its weight swinging gently from a pole held between two men. The walk back feels shorter now that the mission has succeeded. Smoke from the colony's fires becomes visible through the trees long before you reach the clearing. When the hunters emerge from the forest, several settlers hurry forward to see the result. Smiles appear. Quiet congratulations are exchanged. Tonight's meal will be better than most. Another interesting observation recorded in early colonial writings describes how small hunting successes often lifted morale dramatically. Even a single animal could provide several meals when carefully divided among many people. You watch as the turkey is prepared near the fire. Feathers are removed carefully. The smell of cooking meat soon fills the clearing. It is a rich, comforting scent that spreads through the cold afternoon air. People gather nearby, speaking more easily now than they did earlier in the morning. For a little while, hunger loosens its grip. As evening approaches, the sky turns soft shades of amber above the forest. Smoke rises in thin grey lines from the cooking fires. Tonight the settlement will eat, not extravagantly, but gratefully. And as darkness settles slowly across the clearing, the simple meal reminds everyone that survival here depends on many small victories. Tomorrow hunger will return, but tonight there is warmth, there is food, and for the moment that is enough. Night arrives earlier than you expect. The sun slips behind the forest long before the day truly feels finished, leaving the clearing wrapped in a slow creeping twilight. The air grows colder with every passing minute. The warmth from the cooking fires fades quickly once the last of the food has been shared. You sit near one of the small shelters that has finally been completed. Calling it a house would be generous. It is a square wooden structure made from thick logs stacked together. The gaps packed tightly with clay and straw. The roof slopes slightly downward, covered with rough wooden boards that creak whenever the wind moves across them. Still, compared to sleeping out in the open air, it feels like a palace. You step inside. The floor is packed dirt. A few blankets lie rolled against the wall. The room smells strongly of fresh timber smoke, damp earth, and the faint lingering scent of the turkey that was cooked earlier. A small fire burns in the centre of the room inside a shallow pit lined with stones. Smoke rises slowly upward toward a narrow opening in the roof. Most of it escapes. Some of it lingers. Your eyes sting slightly at first, but after a few minutes the smell becomes strangely comforting. Smoke means warmth. Smoke means safety from the deep cold outside. You lower yourself onto a folded blanket. After a long day of work and walking, even this rough bedding feels surprisingly welcome. A widely accepted historical reality is that early colonial homes often lacked proper chimneys at first. Many houses simply used central fire pits with smoke holes in the roof. This meant indoor air was frequently hazy, and clothing absorbed the smell of smoke almost constantly. Clean air was not exactly a luxury people could demand. Still, warmth mattered far more. You stretch your legs carefully, feeling the stiffness in your muscles from days of labour. Across the room, another settler adjusts a log in the fire, sending a fresh wave of sparks upward. Outside, the wind brushes against the walls. The log shifts slightly with a soft creaking sound. For a moment, you listen carefully. The night here is different from anything you might know in a modern town. There are no distant engines, no electric hum, no glowing streetlights pushing darkness away. Here, darkness truly exists. Beyond the firelight inside the house, the world quickly disappears into shadow. The forest outside is invisible now, though. It stands only a short distance away. Tall trees, thick branches, and countless hidden animals occupy that darkness. Your imagination fills the silence. A small but fascinating observation appears in some early settler writings. Many colonists reported that the unfamiliar sounds of American forests made sleeping difficult at first. Owls calling branches snapping and animals moving through leaves often sounded far more threatening than they truly were. You begin to understand that feeling. From somewhere outside comes a sudden rustling noise. Someone near the door glances up immediately. The sound passes quickly. Perhaps only wind moving through fallen leaves, or a small animal searching for food. Still, everyone listens for a few seconds before relaxing again. Inside the shelter, the fire crackles softly. The light flickers across the wooden walls, creating moving shadows that sway gently with the flames. It is strangely hypnotic. You lean back against the log wall. The wood is cool but solid. This simple structure represents safety that did not exist only a few days ago. Earlier tonight, the settlers shared the wild turkey from the hunt. The portions were not large, but the warm food helped ease the cold settling across the land. Someone quietly mentions that winter storms may arrive soon. Snow sometimes begins early in this region. The thought settles over the room like an unwelcome guest. Yet no one speaks much about it. Instead, the conversation drifts towards small practical matters. Tomorrow more firewood must be gathered. Another shelter must be finished. Food supplies must be counted carefully. Daily survival leaves little room for long discussions. Another curious little detail appears in historical letters from early colonists. Some settlers attempted to maintain evening routines that reminded them of home. Quiet reading from a Bible, simple prayers, or soft conversation helped preserve a sense of normal life, even here at the edge of an unfamiliar continent. Across the fire, someone begins speaking softly about England. About narrow village roads, about green fields divided by stone fences, about church bells that could be heard across the countryside on Sunday mornings. The images feel distant now, almost unreal. You close your eyes briefly while listening. The warmth from the fire spreads slowly through the room. The sound of voices fades into a low murmur. Outside, the wind moves through the forest again with a long whispering sound. One topic that scholars still examine involves the sleeping arrangements inside early colonial homes. Space was extremely limited, so several people often shared a single room. Privacy was rare and personal comfort was not always possible. Tonight proves that point clearly. More settlers enter the shelter seeking warmth as the cold intensifies outside. Blankets are spread across the floor. People settle wherever space allows. No one complains. There is relief simply in being indoors. The fire burns lower, now glowing red between dark pieces of wood. Shadows soften across the walls as the light fades. Your eyes grow heavy. Fatigue from the day finally takes hold. Before sleep fully arrives, you notice something interesting. Despite the cold, despite the hunger, despite the endless uncertainty of life in this new world, a strange calm has settled over the room. The shelter holds warmth. The fire still glows, and outside the forest watches quietly beneath the stars. Tonight you will sleep inside a house in America in the year 1620. It may be rough, it may be smoky, but it is home for now. Morning returns, slowly carried in on a pale silver light that leaks through the smoke hole above the fire pit. The room smells strongly of wood smoke and damp wool blankets. Someone nearby stirs first, pushing themselves upright with a quiet groan as stiff muscles protest another cold night. You open your eyes to the soft crackle of embers. The fire has almost gone out again. Cold air lingers in the shelter, thin and sharp against your face. For a moment you stay still beneath your blanket, listening to the quiet sounds of people waking around you. A cough here, a shifting blanket there, the low whisper of someone blowing gently on the fire to coax life back into the glowing coals. Eventually small flames appear again. The warmth spreads slowly across the room. You sit up and stretch carefully. The log wall behind you is cool against your shoulders. Outside, the wind has calmed during the night, leaving the morning air still and silent. When you step outside the shelter, the clearing looks very different in early daylight. Frost covers the ground. Every blade of grass sparkles with tiny crystals. The fallen leaves scattered between the tree stumps shine faintly under the pale morning sun. Your breath drifts in white clouds when you exhale. Winter is creeping closer with quiet determination. The settlement now contains several rough shelters clustered near the centre of the clearing. Smoke rises gently from their roofs as small fires are restarted inside. The ship still rests offshore in the distance, its dark shape floating calmly beyond the pale waves. For a moment you stand quietly taking in the scene. Only a few weeks ago this place held nothing but forest and grass. Now it holds a fragile village. A well-established historical understanding tells us that the Plymouth settlers were not alone in this region. The land surrounding them belonged to the Wampanoag Confederacy, a powerful network of native communities who had lived along the coast for generations. Their villages, trade routes and seasonal hunting grounds stretched across much of this area. In other words, you're standing inside someone else's homeland. But at this moment, the Wampanoag remain mostly unseen. You walk toward the edge of the clearing where the forest begins again. Several settlers are already preparing tools for the day's work. Axes rest against tree trunks. A saw lies across a fallen log waiting to be used. Beyond them, the woods stretch deep and quiet. It's easy to imagine that nothing lives out there, yet that assumption would be very wrong. A small but fascinating detail from native history explains that the Wampanoag people were highly skilled farmers, fishermen and traders long before the English arrived. Their society was organized into villages connected by alliances under the leadership of a chief known as a sahim. Their knowledge of this land was deep and precise. They understood the rivers, the seasons, the forests and the animals in ways the settlers had barely begun to learn. You step carefully toward the trees. The forest floor remains soft with fallen leaves and pine needles. Sunlight filters through the branches above, creating shifting patterns of gold and shadow across the ground. The quiet feels peaceful, but you are not alone. Not far beyond the edge of the clearing, someone may already be watching. One subject that continues to interest researchers concerns the early observations between native communities and the new settlers. Many historians believe native people likely noticed the English long before the colonists ever realized they were being observed. From a hidden ridge or behind thick brush, curious eyes may have studied the strange newcomers building houses beside the coast. The settlers wrapped in wool coats and heavy hats must have looked unusual compared to the clothing worn by the native communities of the region. You pause beside a large oak tree at the forest edge. The bark is rough beneath your fingers. A squirrel darts across a branch high above you, pausing briefly to examine the clearing before disappearing again into the leaves. Life here moves quietly but constantly. Behind you, the settlement begins its daily routine again. The steady rhythm of axes striking wood returns to the morning air. Someone calls out instructions as logs are dragged into position for another house frame. The colony grows one structure at a time. But even as work continues, the presence of nearby native societies begins to shape the future of this settlement. A curious cultural note from early accounts reveals that the Wampanoag practiced seasonal movement across the landscape. Some villages were occupied year-round, while others were used during particular seasons for fishing, farming, or hunting. This meant that the surrounding forests and rivers might hold temporary camps or travel routes the settlers did not yet understand. The land holds stories invisible to new arrivals. You walk back towards the centre of the clearing where a small group gathers around a stack of supplies brought from the ship. Barrels are opened carefully. Food portions are counted and divided. Rationing becomes stricter now. Every person receives only what can be spared. The mood feels quiet but determined. No one speaks loudly. No one wastes energy. Waste energy. Everyone seems to sense that survival here depends not only on hard work but also on learning. Learning the seasons, learning the forests, and perhaps most importantly learning about the people who already know this land. A light breeze moves across the clearing again, carrying the faint smell of salt from the distant ocean. Somewhere beyond the trees a crow calls sharply. The sound echoes briefly through the quiet woods before fading. You glance once more toward the forest edge. For now it remains empty, but soon enough the settlers and the Wampanoag will meet. And when that moment arrives, the future of this fragile colony may change forever. The morning passes in its usual rhythm of chopping wood, hauling branches, and repairing the simple structures that now form the small cluster of homes in the clearing. Smoke drifts steadily upward from the rooftops while the smell of fresh timber and damp earth lingers in the cool air. Yet something different happens today. It begins quietly. You're stacking firewood near the edge of the clearing when one of the settlers suddenly pauses, staring toward the forest. At first you see nothing, only tall trunks and tangled branches standing in shadow. Then movement appears between the trees. A figure steps forward, not cautious, not nervously, but with calm confidence. The man walks directly out of the forest toward the settlement as if he has every right to be there. His posture is upright, his pace steady. The wool coats and heavy boots worn by the settlers contrast sharply with his appearance. His clothing is made from animal skins and woven materials suited to the land. His hair moves gently in the wind as he approaches. Several settlers freeze where they stand. No one had quite expected this moment to arrive so suddenly. Yet here it is. A native man stands calmly in the middle of the clearing, looking around at the wooden houses, the piles of tools, and the small group of surprised colonists staring back at him. Then he speaks. In English, "Welcome." The word seems to hang in the air like a strange echo. It takes a moment before anyone reacts. This man is known to history as Samoset, a member of the Abenaki people who had learned English through contact with fishermen and traders along the northern coasts. When he walked into the Plymouth settlement in the spring of 1621, the settlers were stunned to hear their own language spoken so clearly. The simple greeting must have felt almost miraculous. You watch as the tension in the clearing slowly begins to soften. Some settlers exchange uncertain glances. Others step forward cautiously. Samoset stands patiently studying the newcomers with visible curiosity. His expression carries neither fear nor aggression. If anything, he seems interested in these strange people who have built wooden houses along the shoreline. A small but delightful historical detail often mentioned in the story involves Samoset's request shortly after arriving. After greeting the settlers, he reportedly asked if they had any beer. After a long Atlantic voyage and months of cold hardship, the settlers probably understood that request very well. Someone eventually brings a small drink and some food for the visitor. The mood shifts gradually from shock to cautious hospitality. Samoset sits comfortably among the settlers, speaking with them as best he can. The conversation is slow and sometimes awkward, but communication is possible. You sit nearby listening as Samoset explains that the land surrounding the settlement belongs to the Wampanoag Confederacy led by a Sachem named Massasoit. The villages of this confederacy spread across much of the coastal region. In other words, the settlers have unknowingly placed themselves inside an existing political landscape. An important historical understanding highlights that relationships between native groups and European settlers often depended heavily on diplomacy during these early encounters. Alliances, trade agreements, and shared survival strategies could shape the future of both communities. For the Plymouth colony, this meeting would become extremely important. Samoset explains that another native man named Tisquantum, often called Squanto, speaks English even more fluently and has deeper connections with the Wampanoag leadership. He promises to return with him soon. The settlers listen carefully. Many of them already realize how valuable this connection might be. Knowledge of the land, the rivers, and the food sources could make the difference between survival and disaster. Outside the settlement, the forest continues its quiet watch. Wind moves softly through the branches above. Sunlight flickers between the leaves. Somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker taps rhythmically against a hollow trunk. The The world beyond the clearing feels vast and full of unknown possibilities. Later that afternoon, Samoset walks calmly back toward the forest. No guards escort him. No weapons are raised. He simply disappears among the trees the same way he arrived, leaving behind a settlement buzzing quietly with conversation. People gather near the fires discussing what just happened. Some feel hopeful. Others remain cautious. Trust between unfamiliar cultures rarely forms instantly. Yet the meeting has opened a door. You walk toward the forest edge, again looking out across the same shadowed trees where Samoset first appeared. It is strange to imagine that this landscape holds communities, villages, and entire histories that these settlers have barely begun to understand. One ongoing topic among historians concerns the exact nature of early diplomacy between the Plymouth settlers and the Wampanoag. Some scholars suggest the alliance that soon formed was mutually beneficial. Others point out that the Wampanoag may have viewed the newcomers as potential partners against rival native groups. Either way, cooperation soon followed, and that cooperation would help the fragile colony survive its most dangerous early years. As evening approaches, the clearing grows quieter again. The sky turns pale gold above the treetops. Smoke rises gently from cooking fires. The smell of wood smoke drifts slowly across the settlement. You sit near the fire thinking about the man who walked confidently out of the forest and greeted strangers in their own language. One word: welcome! Sometimes history changes direction in moments that simple. And tonight, as darkness settles across the trees once more, the colony rests with a new understanding. They are not alone in this land, and perhaps that realization might save them. Morning begins again with the quiet glow of a fire and the slow stirring of tired bodies inside the wooden shelters. The cold air lingers inside the room even after the flames have been coaxed back to life. You sit up and rub your hands together, feeling the stiffness in your fingers before holding them close to the warmth. Outside the settlement wakes in the same gradual way it always does. A door creaks open. Boots crunch softly over full frost. Someone coughs while stepping into the pale morning light. Life here does not rush. It unfolds slowly like the sunrise spreading across the trees beyond the clearing. You step outside and take a deep breath. The air smells sharp and clean. Frost sparkles across the ground again, though. The sunlight has already begun melting it in thin patches. Smoke from several cooking fires drifts upward into the still sky. Today will be another long day of work. You walk toward the center of the settlement where several people have already gathered, around a rough wooden table made from planks resting on 2 barrels. A small pile of tools lies on top. Axes, wooden mallets, iron wedges, and a saw that looks heavy enough to require 2 people to operate. Work assignments are quietly discussed. Someone must continue building the next shelter. Another group will collect firewood. A few settlers will walk to the shoreline to unload more supplies from the ship. Every task matters. A widely accepted historical detail reminds us that daily life in early colonial settlements was dominated almost entirely by physical labour. From sunrise until dusk, nearly every hour was spent gathering resources, building structures, preparing food or repairing tools. Leisure was a rare luxury. You pick up a small hand axe and join a group heading toward the forest edge. The path you follow is not truly a path yet. It is simply a section of flattened grass where many boots have walked back and forth over the past few weeks. The forest greets you with the same quiet patience as always. Tall trunks stretch upward like pillars and keys supporting a green ceiling of hollow branches. Fallen leaves cover the ground, their colours faded now into browns and deep reds as autumn continues fading toward winter. Someone ahead begins marking a tree for cutting. The axe strikes the bark with a sharp sound that echoes softly between the trunks. Soon another joins it, and another. The steady rhythm of chopping fills the forest once again. You take your turn lifting the axe and bringing it down against the wood. The impact travels through your arms with a solid vibration. Chips scatter across the ground as the blade bites into the trunk. It is hard work. After only a few minutes, your shoulders begin to ache. Yet the tree barely seems to notice. A curious little historical observation sometimes mentioned in colonial journals explains that early settlers often underestimated just how much timber they would need. Houses, fences, firewood storage buildings, and defensive walls all required enormous amounts of wood. Forests seemed endless, but cutting them into useful shapes required patience and strength. You step back to rest while another settler continues the work. Sweat glistens on his forehead despite the cool air. Each swing sends fresh chips flying outward. Gradually the tree begins to lean. Everyone steps back carefully. The final crack echoes loudly as the trunk splits and the tree falls through the branches around it. Leaves shake loose and drift downward in a soft rain of brown and gold. The sound travels far through the weirwoods. For a moment the forest grows quiet again after the echo fades. You help trim the branches using the smaller axe. The fresh scent of sap fills the air. Pine needles cling to your coat as you drag the cut limbs into a pile. Some will become firewood. Others may be shaped into beams for new buildings. By midday, the group begins hauling the prepared logs back toward the clearing. The weight of each piece requires 2 or 3 people working together. Thick ropes are tied around the trunk so they can be dragged across the ground. Your boots leave deep tracks in the soft soil as you pull. When the settlement finally appears between the trees, smoke rises in steady columns above the roofs. The smell of cooking drifts through the air, making your stomach notice that several hours have passed since breakfast. Food today is simple again. A pot of thin stew simmers above the fire. It contains beans, bits of dried meat, and whatever herbs someone gathered nearby. The taste is mild but satisfying after the morning's labour. You sit on a log beside the fire while eating slowly. Across the clearing, more work continues. A new shelter frame stands partially completed, its thick beams forming a square skeleton against the sky. 2 settlers climb carefully along the beams to fasten roof supports into place. Another group repairs a broken cartwheel. Everywhere you look, hands are moving. One question that scholars continue to examine involves how settlers organise labour within early colonies like Plymouth. Some records suggest work assignments were shared communally during the earliest months, with everyone contributing to projects that benefited the entire settlement. Individual farms would come later. For now, cooperation keep everyone alive. The afternoon passes in much the same rhythm. Logs are rolled into place. Mud is mixed to seal the walls. Firewood piles grow taller beside each house. By late afternoon, the sky begins turning pale gold again beyond the treetops. Long shadows stretch across the clearing while the wind carries the faint scent of the ocean inland. Your arms ache. Your clothes smell strongly of smoke and fresh timber. Yet as you step back to look at the settlement, something remarkable becomes clear. The village is slowly taking shape. What was once only a grassy clearing now contains houses, storage piles, tools and paths worn into the earth by daily footsteps. Life here may be difficult, but it is growing stronger each day. And tomorrow, when the sun rises once more above the silent forest, the work will begin again. The cold settles deeper into the mornings now. When you step outside the shelter, the ground crunches faintly beneath your boots as frost coats the grass. The air smells sharp, almost metallic, the kind of cold that wakes you fully even before the day has properly begun. You pull your coat tighter and glance around the clearing. Smoke rises from several houses. A few settlers move quietly between buildings, carrying small bundles of wood to restart the morning fires. The forest surrounding the settlement remains calm and watchful, its tall branches swaying gently under a pale sky. Today you notice something simple but important: clothing. Not in the way people think about fashion today, but in the quiet, practical way it shapes survival. Every person in the settlement wears layers meant to block windtrap warmth and last through endless work. The neat black outfits, often shown in paintings of the early colonists, rarely tell the full story. Most clothing here looks worn, patched and faded. A firmly established historical understanding tells us that 17th century settlers relied heavily on wool garments. Wool held warmth even when damp, which made it far more reliable than lighter fabrics in the cold and rainy climate of New England. You run your hand along your sleeve. The wool feels thick and slightly rough against your skin. Beneath it you wear a linen shirt that has already been washed and dried many times since the voyage across the Atlantic. The cloth has softened but remains sturdy. Your trousers are made from heavy fabric designed to withstand constant work. Around your waist, at a simple belt, holds a small knife and a pouch for carrying useful items. Shoes here are perhaps the most valuable part of anyone's clothing. Leather boots protect feet from cold soil, sharp stones, and endless walking. Without them, daily life would quickly become miserable. You glance down at the ground again. Even through the thick leather soles, you can feel how cold the earth has become. Nearby, a woman kneels beside a wooden basin filled with water heated over the fire. She carefully washes a bundle of clothing, rubbing the fabric against itself to remove dirt and smoke stains. Laundry here requires patience. There are no machines, no soap bars neatly wrapped in paper. Instead, settlers often use simple lye mixtures made from wood, ash and water to clean their garments. A small but amusing detail sometimes noted in early colonial records describes how washing clothes could easily take an entire day. Boiling water, scrubbing fabric, rinsing garments in cold streams and hanging them to dry demanded constant attention. Clean clothing was earned through effort. You walk toward the edge of the clearing where a group of settlers gathers around a rough wooden bench. One man repairs a torn sleeve using needle and thread, while another examines a pair of worn boots that need new stitching along the sole. Tools for sewing and the leatherwork are carefully protected. These small items can mean the difference between warmth and misery during the winter months. You sit beside them and watch the repair work. The needle moves slowly through thick fabric guided by steady hands. Each stitch pulls the cloth together again, closing the gash where the seam had opened. Simple tasks like this fill many quiet moments of colonial life. One topic that researchers still examine involves the exact sources of clothing materials used by early settlers. Some garments were brought from England, but others were gradually made or repaired using resources found in the New World. Animal hides could be tanned into leather. Plant fibers could eventually be woven into cloth. Adaptation was constant. A faint breeze moves through the clearing, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke. You glance toward the forest where sunlight filters through the branches in soft golden beams. The land beyond the settlement still feels vast and mysterious, yet life inside the clearing continues to grow more organized. A young boy runs past carrying a bundle of firewood nearly as large as his arms can hold. His boots slide slightly on the frosty ground, but he keeps moving with determined steps. Children here do not spend their days in classrooms or playgrounds. They work. A curious observation from colonial writings reveals that children in early settlements often took on responsibilities at surprisingly young ages. Helping gather firewood, carrying water, tending animals, and assisting with cooking were all common tasks. Childhood here blends quickly into adulthood. The boy drops his bundle beside one of the houses and returns toward the woodpile for another load. You stand and walk toward the cooking fire where a small pot simmers quietly. The smell drifting from it suggests another simple meal of beans and herbs. Someone stirs the pot slowly with a wooden spoon, careful not to waste a single ingredient. Clothing dries on lines stretched between two poles nearby. Shirts flutter gently in the cold breeze. Wool coats hang heavily, their dark colours absorbing the sunlight while they dry. Looking at them, you realise how important these garments truly are. They protect against cold winds. They shield skin from rough work. They carry the smell of smoke that becomes a constant companion in this settlement. Your own coat already holds that familiar scent. Smoke, pine, damp wool, and the faint salt of ocean air. It is the smell of life in America in the year 1620. As the afternoon light begins to fade, settlers gather their freshly washed clothing and fold repaired garments carefully. Boots are placed near fires to dry, needles and thread are stored safely away. Every piece of clothing will be needed again tomorrow, and tomorrow will bring another cold morning, another day of work, another reminder that survival in this new world depends not only on strength and courage, but also on small practical things. Warm coats, strong boots, and the patience to repair what you already have. The next morning carries a softer light than usual. Thin clouds drift across the sky, turning the sunlight pale and gentle as it spreads over the clearing. You step outside the shelter and notice the quiet movement of several small figures already crossing the frosted grass. Children. They move quickly despite the cold, their boots tapping lightly against the ground while they carry small bundles or tools. One boy drags a short branch behind him like a walking stick. A girl follows with a wooden bucket that seems almost too large for her hands. Life here does not allow long years of carefree childhood. Everyone contributes. You walk slowly towards the cooking fire, where several of the younger settlers gather, while an older woman prepares a pot of morning stew. The children watch closely as she adds handfuls of beans and dried herbs to the boiling water. Their curiosity feels natural. Cooking is something they will all learn soon enough. An important historical understanding about early colonial communities reveals that children formed a significant portion of the population. Families often brought several children with them across the Atlantic, hoping to build new lives in a land where opportunities might be greater than in England. Yet the reality they encountered demanded maturity far earlier than expected. You sit on a nearby log and watch a small group of boys carrying firewood from the edge of the clearing. The branches look awkward in their arms, but they walk with determined focus. One boy trips slightly over a tree root and laughs as the bundle slides into the grass. Another helps him gather the fallen sticks again. Moments like this remind you that they are still children even if their responsibilities are heavy. A little historical curiosity sometimes mentioned in colonial writings describes how children in early settlements often learned practical skills through observation rather than formal teaching. A child might watch an adult repair a tool or prepare food, and then gradually attempt the task themselves. Learning happened everywhere. The kitchen fire, the forest, the workbench. You glance toward the forest edge where a young girl kneels beside a patch of frozen soil. She studies something carefully before calling out to another child nearby. Soon both of them crouch low, examining the ground with intense interest. Perhaps they have found animal tracks. Tracking small animals becomes an important skill here. Rabbits, squirrels, and birds can provide valuable food when larger game remains difficult to catch. The children seem excited by their discovery. You walk closer and see the faint shape of tiny footprints pressed into the frost. They lead from the forest toward a pile of stored grain near one of the houses. A mouse, most likely. Small creatures often follow human settlements once food becomes available. One subject that historians continue discussing involves how colonial children adapted psychologically to this unfamiliar world. Some scholars believe young settlers adjusted quickly to the rhythms of wilderness life. Others suggest the constant labour and uncertainty created challenges that modern people might find difficult to imagine. Looking at the children in front of you, both ideas seem possible. They move easily across the clearing, yet their daily tasks would exhaust many adults. Near the cooking fire, the morning meal's finally ready. The woman ladles small portions of stew into wooden bowls. Children gather quietly, waiting for their share. No one pushes forward. Everyone understands that food must be divided carefully. You notice that the youngest children receive help holding their bowls steady. The stew is hot, and spilling even a small portion would mean losing valuable nourishment. They sit together on a long wooden plank while eating slowly. Steam rises from the bowls into the cool air. The smell of beans and herbs spreads gently across the clearing. Nearby, an older boy practices using a small axe beneath the watchful eye of an adult. The tool looks large in his hands, but he swings carefully, striking a thin branch placed across a stump. The branch splits with a clean crack. A smile spreads across his face. Another interesting cultural detail appears in several early colonial accounts. Many children began learning adult tasks surprisingly early, sometimes around the age of 7 or 8. By their teenage years, they often possessed the same working skills as older settlers. Adulthood arrived quickly in a place like this. You lean back slightly on the log while watching the activity around you. Children carrying water. Children gathering sticks. Children practicing the same skills their parents use every day. The settlement depends on their help more than anyone might admit. As the morning grows brighter, the children finish their meal and return to their tasks. One girl collects empty bowls and carries them carefully toward the washing basin. 2 boys race briefly toward the woodpile before slowing down when an adult reminds them to focus on their work. Even play here blends easily with responsibility. A light breeze drifts through the clearing, stirring the smoke from the fires and sending dry leaves sliding across the ground. Beyond the trees, the distant ocean glimmers faintly under the shifting clouds. You stand and brush frost from your coat. Another day in the settlement has begun. And just like the adults around them, the children will spend every hour learning how to survive in this new world. Step by step, task by task, growing older faster than anyone expected. The air carries a different feeling today. It is not only cold, it is heavy. You notice it first in the quiet movements of the settlers around you. Conversations remain softer than usual. Faces look tired even in the early morning light. A few people cough as they walk across the clearing, pulling their coats close against the wind. Illness has begun to move through the settlement. It starts quietly. One person wakes with a fever. Another complains of aching joints. Soon several settlers feel too weak to work, remaining inside the smoky shelters while others continue the daily tasks outside. A widely accepted historical understanding explains that disease was one of the greatest threats faced by early colonial settlements. Limited medical knowledge, poor nutrition, and harsh living conditions created an environment where sickness could spread quickly. In Plymouth, during the first winter illness would claim many lives. You step carefully into one of the shelters where a sick man rests on a pile of blankets near the fire. His breathing sounds slow and uneven. A woman kneels beside him, placing a damp cloth against his forehead. The room smells strongly of smoke and herbal remedies. A small pot sits beside the fire containing a mixture of boiled plants gathered from the nearby forest. The liquid has a bitter smell that fills the shelter. Medicine in 1620 is very different from what you might expect today. Doctors are rare in remote colonies, and treatments often rely on traditional remedies carried from Europe. Herbs, poultices, heated compresses, and careful rest become the main tools available to those trying to help the sick. You sit quietly near the door, watching the woman stir the pot. A curious medical practice from the 17th century involved the use of herbal infusions believed to balance the body's internal humours. According to the medical theories common at the time, illness occurred when these humours became unbalanced. Restoring balance through herbs, diet, or controlled bloodletting was considered an effective approach. Of course, modern understanding tells us that many of these treatments did little to stop disease. Still, people used the knowledge they had. Outside the shelter, the settlement continues its work, though with fewer hands available. The sound of axes rises faintly through the thin walls. Someone drags a heavy log across the clearing, its rough bark scraping against frozen soil. Life cannot pause simply because sickness appears. You step outside again. Cold wind brushes your face while you walk toward the firewood pile. Several settlers gather there, speaking quietly about how many people are now resting inside the houses. Concern shows in their voices. One man mentions that the cold weather may be weakening everyone. Another wonders if the long voyage across the ocean left many bodies too exhausted to recover easily. These thoughts are not unreasonable. Months of travel, poor food, cramped living conditions, and unfamiliar climate have all taken their toll. A small but interesting historical detail appears in letters from early colonists describing how settlers sometimes relied on simple preventative measures to avoid illness. Drinking warm broth, staying close to fires, and wearing additional layers of wool were believed to strengthen the body against disease. Whether these methods worked consistently is another question. You carry a bundle of firewood toward one of the shelters where several sick settlers are resting. The door opens slowly, releasing a wave of smoky warmth into the cold air. Inside the room feels quiet and dim. 3 people lie beneath blankets near the fire. One woman sleeps peacefully, though her breathing remains shallow. Another man sits upright, sipping a small cup of the herbal mixture prepared earlier. The smell is sharp and earthy. You place the firewood beside the hearth and step back toward the door. One subject that scholars still examine involves the role of native knowledge in helping European settlers survive illness in the New World. Some native communities possessed extensive understanding of medicinal plants and natural remedies that later proved valuable to struggling colonies. At this early moment, however, those exchanges have not yet fully developed. For now, the settlers rely mostly on the remedies they carried from England. Outside, the sky begins to shift toward afternoon colours. Pale sunlight glows faintly through thin clouds, casting soft light across the clearing. Despite the illness spreading through the settlement, work continues with determined focus. A new roof beam is lifted into place. Mud is mixed to seal another wall. Water is carried from the nearby stream. Everyone understands the difficult truth. Shelter, warmth, and food remain the strongest defences against sickness. As evening approaches, the fires burn brighter inside each house. The smell of herbal mixtures drifts gently through the village. Quiet voices speak comforting words to those who struggle with fever or pain. You sit near one of the fires, watching sparks rise into the darkening sky. The forest beyond the clearing remains silent. Night slowly spreads across the land, and inside the fragile settlement people do what humans have always done when illness arrives. They wait, they hope, and they care for one another as best they can. The following morning arrives slowly, as if the land itself wishes to linger in quiet darkness a little longer. A grey sky hangs above the settlement, and the air feels thick with cold moisture drifting inland from the sea. You step outside your shelter and notice how still everything seems. Smoke rises straight upward from the chimneys and roof holes, barely moving in the calm air. Frost still clings to the grass, even though the sun has technically risen. The clearing carries a quiet mood that feels almost thoughtful. Religion shapes much of the life here, even when no one speaks about it directly. Before most settlers begin their work each morning, a few gather near the largest house in the clearing. Today you see them standing together again, heads lowered slightly as someone reads aloud from a small worn book. A deeply rooted historical reality is that many of the settlers who arrived in Plymouth were religious dissenters from England. They had crossed the Atlantic hoping to build a community where they could practice their faith according to their own beliefs without interference from authorities they felt had corrupted the church. Their journey across the ocean was not only about survival, it was also about conviction. You move closer, standing quietly near the edge of the small group. The man reading speaks calmly, his voice steady as it carries across the frosty clearing. The words echo softly against the wooden walls of the nearby houses. The settlers listen with quiet focus. Some close their eyes, others simply stare toward the ground while the reading continues. Faith here offers something important, a sense of structure, a reminder that even in this uncertain land there are principles guiding daily life. After the reading ends, the group remains silent for a moment. A few murmured prayers follow before people slowly drift away toward their morning tasks. You walk toward the fire where breakfast is being prepared. The pot contains another thin stew, though today someone has added a few dried berries gathered earlier in the season. Their sweetness changes the smell, slightly creating a small but welcome difference from the usual meals. A curious cultural detail sometimes mentioned in early colonial writings describes how settlers often held days of prayer during moments of difficulty. These gatherings were believed to strengthen both the spirit and the community when hardships threatened their survival. In a place like this, where winter looms and illness lingers in several houses, those moments of reflection probably carry real comfort. You sit beside the fire and eat slowly. The berries burst softly between your teeth, offering a surprising sweetness that feels almost luxurious compared to the usual salt and herbs. Around you, the settlement begins moving again. Axes are lifted. Logs are rolled. Someone leads a small group toward the shoreline to check supplies brought from the ship. Daily life continues, guided not only by practical needs but also by shared beliefs. One subject that continues to interest historians concerns how strictly religious rules were enforced in early colonies like Plymouth. Some scholars suggest the community maintained very firm expectations about behaviour, while others believe daily survival often took priority over strict enforcement of moral codes. Either way, faith remained central to their identity. You walk toward the edge of the clearing again, where the forest stands quiet beneath the grey sky. The wind has not returned yet. Leaves hang motionless on the branches above you. A sense of calm fills the woods. Even the animals seem quiet today. You kneel beside a small patch of earth where frost has begun melting under the faint sunlight. The ground beneath remains hard, reminding you again how close winter has come. Behind you, the settlement hums softly with activity. A woman carries water from the stream. Two men argue gently over how best to fit a roof beam into place. Children gather sticks along the tree line. All of it unfolds beneath the quiet awareness that life here rests on fragile foundations. Yet faith offers the settlers something steady to hold on to. It reminds them why they came, why they endured the long voyage, why they continue building houses and lighting fires even when the future feels uncertain. The afternoon drifts by in slow rhythm. Clouds move across the sky in soft layers of grey and pale blue. Smoke from the settlement fires spreads gently over the clearing before dissolving into the cold air. As evening approaches, the settlers gather once more near their homes. Some speak quietly, Others simply sit near the fires, watching the flames dance against the growing darkness. You sit with them, listening to the quiet crackle of burning wood. Above the settlement, the first stars begin appearing through the thinning clouds. The forest remains calm. The houses glow softly with firelight. And somewhere within the steady routines of work, prayer, and survival, the fragile colony continues taking root in this unfamiliar land. The next morning greets you with a pale gold horizon beyond the trees. Thin sunlight slips quietly across the clearing while the fires from the night before are coaxed back into life. A faint layer of frost still covers the ground, though the air feels slightly softer today, as if the land itself is taking a brief pause before winter tightens its grip again. You stretch your arms and step outside the shelter. The village is beginning to look more settled now. Paths have formed naturally between the houses where countless footsteps have pressed the grass flat. Stacks of firewood lean neatly beside doorways. Tools rest against walls where they were left at the end of yesterday's work. It no longer feels like a temporary camp. It feels like a place trying very hard to become permanent. Today your attention turns towards something equally important. Food that can grow. A widely accepted historical reality tells us that early settlers quickly realized they could not rely forever on stored provisions or occasional hunting success. Establishing reliable agriculture became essential if the colony hoped to survive future seasons. You walk toward a patch of open ground near the edge of the clearing where several settlers have begun preparing soil for planting. The earth is still cold beneath your boots, but the surface has been loosened with wooden spades and simple iron tools. Clumps of soil turn slowly under each careful strike. The work moves at a patient rhythm. Colonial farming here looks very different from the wide fields people might imagine today. Instead of vast organized farmland, these first planting areas resemble small experimental plots carved cautiously from the edge of the wilderness. The settlers are still learning what this land will allow them to grow. You kneel and scoop a handful of soil. It feels darker and softer than the fields many settlers knew in England. Bits of leaf and root mix through the earth, creating a rich texture that suggests promise, though no one can yet say for certain what crops will thrive here. Nearby, a man pushes the wooden hoe into the ground, breaking apart another section of hardened soil. The sound of metal striking small stones echoes faintly through the clearing. A quiet but fascinating historical note often mentioned by researchers involves the agricultural techniques eventually shared by native communities in the region. Local peoples had developed effective methods for cultivating corn beans and squash together, in a system sometimes called companion planting. These crops supported each other in subtle ways. Corn provided structure for climbing beans. Beans enriched the soil. Squash spread broad leaves that helped retain moisture. At this moment, however, the settlers have only begun to understand these methods. For now, they rely mostly on the farming knowledge they carried across the ocean. You watch as someone scatters a small handful of seeds into the freshly turned soil. Each seed is precious. None can be wasted. The rows are uneven but carefully spaced. Planting food in unfamiliar land always carries a sense of quiet hope. A breeze drifts across the clearing, bringing the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. Above you, the sky has cleared into a pale blue stretch that feels wider than any sky you remember from England. It makes the land seem even larger. Beyond the planting area, the forest still waits patiently. Tall trees stand in shadow, their branches whispering softly as the wind passes through them. One ongoing question that scholars still examine concerns how quickly the settlers adopted native agricultural practices once they formed stronger relationships with local communities. Some historians believe the exchange of farming knowledge happened rapidly and helped transform the colony's survival chances. Others suggest the process was slower, shaped by caution and cultural misunderstanding. Either way, adaptation would become essential. You stand and brush soil from your hands while watching the work continue around you. A small wooden fence begins to rise around the planting area, built from thin stakes hammered into the ground. The barrier will help keep animals from wandering through and destroying the fragile seedlings. Deer especially enjoy young plants. Protecting crops will soon become another daily responsibility. Children help carry bundles of thin branches to the workers building the fence. Their arms struggle with the weight, but they move eagerly, excited to contribute. Even the younger settlers understand how important these fields might become. You glance down at the rows of freshly planted seeds. At the moment they look unimpressive, just narrow lines of disturbed soil beneath the cold spring light. Yet within these small patches of earth lies the possibility of future harvests. Corn rising tall against the summer sky, beans twisting upward along green stalks, squash spreading wide leaves across the ground. Food that grows rather than simply being gathered. Food that might allow this fragile village to survive another year. As afternoon sunlight warms the clearing slightly, the work gradually slows. Tools are set aside. Water is carried to soften the soil around the new plantings. The first small farm of the colony has begun. You walk slowly back toward the houses, glancing once more over your shoulder at the quiet rows of seeds resting beneath the earth. For now they remain invisible, but with patience, sunlight and a little luck, they may soon transform this settlement from a desperate outpost into something far more stable. And that simple hope is enough to keep everyone working. Later that afternoon, the smell of smoke drifts through the clearing again, though this time it is not coming from a simple warming fire. It carries the rich scent of food being prepared slowly over steady heat. You follow the smell toward one of the shelters where the cooking fire burns brighter than usual. Inside the small building, the air feels warm and thick with smoke. A large iron pot hangs over the flames from a wooden beam. The fire crackles gently beneath it while steam rises from the simmering contents. Cooking here is not a quick activity. It's a careful daily ritual that requires time, patience, and a steady supply of wood. A well-documented historical truth tells us that most cooking in early colonial homes took place over open hearth fires. Without ovens or modern stoves, settlers relied on pots suspended above flames or simple flat stones placed near the heat. Everything depended on fire. You step closer and look into the pot. A stew bubbles slowly inside, made from dried beans, bits of salted meat and wild herbs collected earlier in the day. The smell is earthy and comforting. Nearby, a woman kneels beside a wooden board chopping vegetables with a small knife. The blade moves carefully through pale roots that were dug from the forest soil that morning. She drops the pieces into the pot one handful at a time. Cooking here also means constant attention. The fire must be adjusted. The pot must be stirred. The ingredients must be added at the right moment so nothing burns or spoils. You sit near the wall and watch the process. The warmth from the fire feels welcome after hours of working outside in the cold wind. Sparks rise occasionally from the flames, floating upward toward the dark beams of the roof before fading away. A fascinating little culinary detail appears in several colonial journals, describing how settlers often adapted recipes from their homeland using unfamiliar local ingredients. Foods that had been common in England sometimes had to be replaced with whatever could be found in the surrounding forests and rivers. Adaptation was constant, even in the kitchen. A wooden spoon scrapes gently along the bottom of the pot as the stew thickens. The sound blends with the soft crackling of the fire, and the distant thud of axes still echoing faintly from the forest. You notice several small tools resting near the hearth. A heavy iron ladle, a clay bowl used for mixing ingredients, a flat stone placed near the flames where thin pieces of dough can be cooked into simple bread. Every item shows signs of constant use. Another aspect of early colonial cooking that scholars often examine involves the amount of time required for even the simplest meals. Without modern conveniences, preparing food could easily occupy several hours of the day. Grinding grain into flour alone demanded steady effort with hand tools. You glance towards the door where a young girl carries in a small basket filled with gathered herbs. She hands them to the woman beside the fire, who nods with quiet approval before adding the leaves to the pot. Children learn cooking tasks early here, not because anyone insists on strict training, but because the entire household depends on shared effort. Outside the shelter, the sky begins slowly shifting toward evening colours. Pale sunlight filters through the doorway, casting long golden beams across the smoky room. The stew continues bubbling steadily. Eventually the smell spreads across the entire settlement. People working outside begin drifting towards the house, drawn by the promise of a warm meal. Boots scrape softly across the floor as settlers enter and gather near the walls. Wooden bowls are passed from hand to hand. The woman lifts the heavy ladle and begins filling them one by one. The steam rising from each bowl carries the scent of herbs and slow-cooked meat. You accept a bowl and sit beside the fire. The stew tastes simple but satisfying. The beans are soft, the broth thick and warm. After a long day of work, the meal feels almost luxurious. Someone near the door breaks a small loaf of bread into several pieces and shares it quietly among the group. Another person adds a few dried berries to their bowl for sweetness. Food here is rarely elaborate, but when shared among tired settlers beside a warm fire, even the most basic meal feels meaningful. Outside, the last light of day fades slowly beyond the forest. Inside the shelter, the fire glows brighter as darkness gathers outside. Voices grow softer. Wooden spoons scrape gently against bowls as the final portions of stew disappear. Cooking in this new world may be slow. It may be smoky. It may require constant effort. Yet each evening meal carries the same quiet reward. Warm food, warm fire, and a small moment of comfort before the cold night returns. The following morning begins with a pale mist drifting slowly across the clearing. The air feels damp and cool, and the distant ocean is hidden behind a thin grey veil that softens the horizon. When you step outside the shelter, the ground feels slightly muddy beneath your boots. During the night, a light rain must have passed through. Small droplets cling to the branches of nearby trees. When the wind moves, they fall gently to the ground like quiet whispers. You pull your coat tighter and glance toward the edge of the forest. Today, a small group of settlers plans to travel beyond the clearing. Not far, but far enough to remind everyone how vast the land surrounding this tiny village truly is. Travel in 1620 rarely means comfort. Paths are uncertain, maps are limited, and much of the surrounding terrain remains completely unfamiliar to the settlers who arrived only weeks ago. You join the small group gathering near the edge of the clearing. Each person carries simple supplies, small bag for food, a knife or musket for protection, a walking stick to steady steps across uneven ground. The journey begins slowly. You move single file into the forest where the soft earth absorbs the sound of your boots. Pine needles and fallen leaves form a natural carpet beneath the trees. The smell of damp soil rises gently with every step. The forest feels calm this morning. Birds call quietly from high branches. A squirrel darts across a fallen log before disappearing into the undergrowth. A firmly established historical understanding explains that early settlers depended heavily on short exploration trips like this. These journeys allowed them to locate freshwater streams, identify hunting areas, and discover resources such as wild plants or clay deposits useful for building. Learning the land meant survival. You step over a narrow stream where clear water moves slowly between smooth stones. Someone pauses to fill a wooden flask while others examine the surrounding trees. The forest stretches endlessly in every direction. Tall trunks rise toward a canopy that filters the morning light into soft green patterns. Occasionally, a small clearing appears where sunlight reaches the forest floor. In those open patches, clusters of unfamiliar plants grow. One man kneels to examine a patch of berries. He studies them carefully before shaking his head. Better not risk it. A small but intriguing observation recorded in colonial writings describes how settlers often relied on cautious experimentation when encountering unknown plants. Some edible foods were discovered only after careful testing, while others caused illness when mistaken for safe varieties. Nature here offers both nourishment and danger. You continue walking deeper into the woods. The path begins climbing a gentle slope where the ground becomes rocky beneath the soil. From the top of the hill, the trees thin slightly, allowing you to see farther across the surrounding land. The view is breathtaking. Rolling forests stretch across the horizon, broken occasionally by narrow rivers glimmering in the distance. The sheer size of the wilderness makes the small settlement behind you seem almost invisible. It reminds you just how isolated the colony truly is. Another subject historians still examine involves how early settlers mentally adjusted to this overwhelming landscape. Some individuals found the endless wilderness inspiring. Others felt uneasy living so far from the familiar boundaries of European towns and farms. Standing here, both feelings make sense. The land is beautiful, but it is also immense. The group rests briefly on the hillside while sharing a small meal of dried meat and hard bread. The food tastes plain, but the fresh air makes it satisfying. Below you, the forest moves gently under a light breeze. Sunlight flickers across the treetops like waves. A curious little travel detail appears in several early accounts describing how settlers sometimes marked trees along exploration routes by cutting small symbols into the bark. These marks help them recognize paths during future journeys. One of the men now carves a small notch into a tree trunk before the group begins descending the hill again. The journey back toward the settlement takes a different route. You follow the edge of a small marsh where tall grasses sway slowly in the wind. Birds rise suddenly from the reeds when the group passes too close. Their wings beat loudly against the quiet air. Eventually, the familiar clearing begins to appear through the trees. Smoke from the settlement fires curls upward in thin grey lines. The simple wooden houses stand clustered together like a small island of human life in a sea of forest. When you step back into the clearing, the sounds of daily work greet you immediately. Axes strike wood. Voices call instructions. Children carry bundles of sticks toward the woodpile. The village feels busy compared to the calm wilderness beyond it, yet the short journey has revealed something important. The settlement is tiny. The land surrounding it is enormous, and learning that land will take many more journeys like this one, step by careful step. Night returns with a deeper darkness than usual. Clouds have gathered across the sky, hiding the stars and leaving the forest wrapped in a thick shadow that seems almost solid. Inside the settlement, fires glow behind the walls of wooden houses, their light spilling gently through doorways and smoke holes. You sit near one of the hearths while the wind outside grows stronger. The fire crackles steadily, casting warm orange light across the log walls. Shadows shift slowly as the flames move, making the small room feel alive with quiet motion. Beyond those walls, the wilderness begins its nighttime rhythm. At first, the sounds are faint, a soft rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. Then another sound follows, a long, wavering howl somewhere deep in the forest. Several people inside the shelter pause when they hear it. The sound fades slowly into the darkness before another answer rises from farther away. Wolves. A commonly accepted historical understanding reminds us that wolves were widespread throughout North America during the early 17th century. These animals travelled in packs and roamed large territories that often included the same forests surrounding colonial settlements. Encounters between wolves and settlers were not everyday events, but their presence was certainly known. You listen carefully as the howl echoes once more through the trees. The sound is haunting but strangely beautiful. It carries across the night air in long, trembling notes before dissolving into silence. Someone near the fire quietly adds another log to the flames. The sparks leap upward briefly before settling again. A small but interesting detail sometimes mentioned in colonial accounts describes how settlers often judged the distance of wolves by listening to the strength of their calls. A faint sound meant the pack was far away. A louder one suggested they might be travelling closer to the settlement. Tonight the howls seem distant. Still, they remind everyone how close the wilderness truly remains. You stand and walk toward the doorway. Outside the clearing appears almost black beneath the cloud-covered sky. Only the faint glow of fires inside the houses breaks the darkness. The forest edge forms a dark wall surrounding the settlement. The wind moves through the branches with a steady whisper. It carries the smell of damp leaves and cold earth. Another howl drifts across the night. This time it sounds slightly farther away. You take a slow breath and look toward the forest. The wilderness does not sleep the way human settlements do. Animals move through the darkness following their own rhythms. Foxes hunt quietly among the trees. Deer wander through open fields. Owls glide silently between branches. Life continues beyond the reach of firelight. One ongoing subject that scholars sometimes discuss involves how settlers perceived these nighttime sounds during the early years of colonization. Some historians believe colonists gradually became accustomed to the wildlife surrounding them. Others suggest that unfamiliar noises in the darkness continue to cause unease long after their arrival. Standing here tonight, both reactions seem understandable. The sounds are, fascinating. But they also remind you how small the settlement is compared to the surrounding wilderness. You return to the fire and sit again beside the others. Conversation resumes. Someone begins telling a quiet story about wolves seen during a hunting trip several days earlier. According to the tale, the animals watched the hunters from a distant ridge before disappearing silently into the trees. Whether the story grows slightly more dramatic with each telling is difficult to say. Stories often do. A curious little observation from early colonial writings notes that storytelling became an important evening activity in many settlements. With few other forms of entertainment available, sharing experiences and memories around the fire helped pass the long winter nights. You can easily understand why. The fire glows warmly. The wind hums softly against the wall, and the distant howls of wolves occasionally drift through the darkness outside. Time passes slowly. Eventually the fire burns lower, leaving only glowing coals scattered among the ash. People begin settling into blankets laid across the floor. The shelter grows quieter as one voice after another fades into sleep. Before closing your eyes, you listen once more to the night beyond the walls. The wolves have grown silent again. Only the wind moves through the forest now, and somewhere out there, hidden beneath the vast dark canopy of trees, the wilderness continues its endless watch over this fragile little colony. Morning arrives with a bright sky and a steady breeze drifting in from the sea. The wind carries the sharp scent of salt across the clearing, mixing with the familiar smells of wood smoke and damp earth. When you step outside the shelter, you notice several settlers already looking toward the distant water. Something has appeared on the horizon. At first, it is only a dark shape against the pale blue surface of the ocean. But as the sunlight strengthens, the outline becomes clearer. A ship. The sight draws quiet excitement through the settlement. People begin gathering along the small rise overlooking the shoreline, shading their eyes while watching the vessel approach. Ships mean connection to the outside world. Supplies, news, possibly new settlers. A widely recognized historical fact reveals that early colonies relied heavily on supply ships arriving from Europe. These vessels carried food tools, clothing, seeds, and sometimes letters that brought precious news from distant families left behind. Without these shipments, many colonies would have struggled even more than they already did. You walk with the others toward the shore. The wind grows stronger near the water, tugging gently at coats and hats. Waves roll steadily against the sand, reflecting the bright morning light in shimmering patterns. The ship moves slowly closer. Its tall masts rise clearly above the water, now sails catching the breeze as it turns toward the coastline. A small boat is lowered from the ship not long after it anchors offshore. Several men climb inside and begin rowing toward land. Everyone waits. Conversations drift quietly through the group. Some settlers hope the ship carries fresh supplies. Others wonder if letters from England might finally arrive. Months of silence can make even the smallest news feel important. One intriguing little detail recorded in several colonial letters mentions how settlers often greeted supply ships with enormous relief. The arrival of familiar goods such as flour tools or clothing could dramatically improve life in a struggling settlement. You watch as the small boat finally reaches the shore. The men step onto the sand and begin unloading wooden crates and sealed barrels. Each container is carried carefully up the beach where several settlers hurry forward to help. Soon the clearing near the shoreline fills with activity. Crates are opened one by one. Inside you glimpse sacks of grain, bundles of cloth iron tools wrapped in straw, and small wooden boxes containing items too valuable to risk damage during the long ocean journey. A few settlers search quickly for letters among the supplies. One man suddenly smiles when he recognizes familiar handwriting on a folded paper sealed with wax. He holds the letter carefully as if it might disappear. Communication with the old world remains rare and precious. Another aspect that historians often examine involves the trade relationships that gradually developed between colonies and passing ships. Over time, settlements like Plymouth would exchange furs, timber, and other local resources for European goods brought across the Atlantic. For now, however, the colony is still too young to offer much in return. The ship's crew shares a few stories about the voyage across the ocean. Storms near the middle of the Atlantic delayed their journey, but the ship eventually found favourable winds along the final stretch of the trip. Listening to them reminds you how vast the ocean truly is. Crossing it requires patience and courage. A curious maritime detail sometimes mentioned in earliest accounts describes how sailors relied heavily on stars and simple navigation instruments to guide their ships across thousands of miles of open water. No modern maps, no radio signals, just experience and careful observation of the sky. You help carry a crate back toward the settlement. Inside are several iron cooking tools that will replace worn utensils currently used in the kitchens. Another crate holds seeds meant for future planting seasons. Each item feels valuable. Every new tool or supply increases the colony's chances of survival. As the afternoon sun climbs higher, the work of unloading continues. Barrels roll across the sand, bundles of rope and canvas are stacked neatly beside the houses. Children watch with wide curiosity as unfamiliar objects appear from the crates. A small metal lantern draws a particular interest. Light that can travel with you through the darkness seems almost magical. Eventually the sailors return to their boat and begin rowing back toward the anchored ship. The wind fills the sails again as the vessel slowly turns away from the coast. The connection lasts only a short time, but its impact remains. You stand beside the others, watching the ship grow smaller against the distant horizon. Behind you the settlement hums with renewed activity as settlers examine their new supplies. The world beyond the forest and the ocean has not forgotten this fragile colony, and sometimes carried on the wind and waves help still arrives. The day after the ship's visit feels strangely energized. New supplies sit stacked beside the houses, their wooden crates opened carefully, so every item can be counted and stored. The arrival of tools, cloth and grain has lifted the spirits of the entire settlement. Even the morning air seems lighter as the sun rises over the clearing. You step outside and notice a small group gathering near the largest house. Today the leaders of the colony plan to discuss how these new resources will be shared and how future work will be organized. Leadership in a place like this requires careful balance. Everyone depends on cooperation, yet decisions must still be made. You walk closer and stand near the edge of the group. Several men speak quietly around a rough wooden table where a few papers have been laid out. The papers flutter slightly in the breeze as one man holds them down with his hand. A widely accepted historical reality tells us that the settlers of Plymouth had already created an agreement known today as the Mayflower Compact. This document established a simple form of self-governance among the colonists, allowing them to create laws and decisions together, rather than relying entirely on distant authority. For such a small and fragile community, this agreement became an important foundation. The discussion continues calmly. How much grain should be saved for planting? How many tools should remain communal property? Who will organize hunting groups in the coming weeks? These decisions may sound simple, but each one affects the survival of everyone in the settlement. You watch as one of the leaders makes small marks on the paper using a quill pen dipped in ink. The writing appears careful and deliberate. Records matter here. Keeping track of supplies, agreements, and responsibilities helps prevent confusion when resources are scarce. A small but interesting detail, sometimes mentioned in early colonial writings, describes how community meetings often took place outdoors whenever weather allowed. Gathering in the open air made it easier for everyone to hear the discussion and participate when necessary. Today the sky remains clear enough for that tradition. A gentle breeze moves through the clearing while the conversation continues. Some settlers speak more than others, but most seem comfortable sharing their opinions. In a community this small, every voice carries weight. One subject that historians often explore involves how democratic the decision-making truly was in early colonies like Plymouth. Some researchers suggest that participation was fairly broad among adult men of the settlement. Others point out that leadership roles still held considerable influence over final decisions. Either way, the need for cooperation shaped daily life. You lean against a wooden fence post while listening. Nearby children play quietly with small sticks they have gathered from the forest. Their laughter drifts softly across the clearing before fading again into the steady murmur of the meeting. Eventually the discussion reaches its conclusion. Grain will be divided carefully between planting supplies and daily meals. Several settlers volunteer to oversee repairs to damaged tools. A small group will begin building another storage building for the growing number of supplies. The decisions seem practical. No one argues loudly. In a place where survival depends on unity, disagreements tend to settle quickly. A curious little detail appears in a few early colonial records. describing how leadership positions were sometimes rotated or re-evaluated as circumstances changed. The challenges of building a settlement often required flexibility rather than rigid authority. You watch as the group begins dispersing. Some head toward the forest with axes to continue cutting timber. Others move toward the shoreline where a few barrels still wait to be carried inland. The settlement returns to its familiar rhythm of work. Yet something subtle has changed. The arrival of supplies and the shared decisions about how to use them have strengthened the sense that this community truly belongs to the people living within it. You walk toward the center of the clearing where several men begin measuring the space for the new storage building. A rope is stretched across the ground to mark the outline of the walls. Soon more trees will be cut, more beams will rise. The village continues expanding one careful structure at a time. Above you, the sky remains bright and wide, the clouds drifting slowly across the blue horizon. The forest beyond the clearing stands quiet beneath the afternoon sun. Life in the settlement may still be fragile, but the people here have begun shaping their own rules, their own responsibilities, and perhaps most importantly, their own shared future. The afternoon settles into a calm rhythm as sunlight drifts gently across the clearing. The sky above Plymouth stretches wide and pale with thin clouds gliding slowly towards the ocean. From where you stand near the edge of the village, the forest appears quiet, almost peaceful. But peaceful does not always mean safe. You notice a small group of settlers gathered near the wooden palisade that has begun to rise along one side of the settlement. Several tall logs stand upright in the soil, their sharpened tops pointing toward the sky, like a row of silent guardians. The wall is not finished yet, but it already changes the feeling of the place. You walk closer, stepping over scattered wood chips and piles of freshly dug earth. A man nearby pushes a shovel into the ground, widening a narrow trench where another log will soon be placed. Building defences may seem strange for such a small settlement, yet uncertainty surrounds this new colony. A widely acknowledged historical reality is that early colonial communities often constructed defensive walls or lookout points during their first years. These structures were meant to guard against possible attacks from rival European powers, unpredictable wildlife, or potential conflicts with unfamiliar native groups. Most of the time, these fears never turned into direct confrontations. Still, caution shaped the planning of early villages. You rest your hands on one of the upright logs and feel the rough texture of the bark beneath your fingers. The wood still smells fresh from the forest where it stood only yesterday. Nearby, another settler uses a heavy wooden mallet to drive the base of a log deeper into the trench. Each strike sends a dull thud across the clearing. The wall slowly grows taller. A small but interesting detail sometimes mentioned in early settlement descriptions involves the height of these defensive palisades. Many were built tall enough to prevent easy climbing, often reaching the height of two men standing one on the other's shoulders. The settlers here are still working toward that goal. You step back and look along the line of logs stretching toward the forest edge. Gaps remain between many of them, but the shape of the barrier is becoming clear. A narrow gate opening has been left in the center. Through that opening, paths lead toward the shoreline and the forest trails used for gathering wood and hunting. Children walk through the unfinished gate carrying small bundles of branches. They seem unconcerned by the growing wall, treating it more like part of the landscape than a defensive structure. To them, it may simply look like another construction project. Yet the adults know its purpose. The wilderness beyond the clearing holds many unknowns. One topic that researchers frequently examine concerns how fearful early settlers truly were of attacks from nearby native communities. Some scholars believe colonists often exaggerated these fears in their writings. Others suggest that tension and misunderstanding occasionally made such concerns seem very real. Standing here, it is easy to understand both perspectives. The forest is vast. The settlers are few. Uncertainty encourages preparation. A gust of wind moves through the clearing carrying dry leaves across the ground. One leaf catches briefly against the sharpened top of the palisade before falling again to the earth. You watch as several men lift another log together and guide it into the trench. Their movements are slow and coordinated, each person adjusting their grip while the heavy wood settles into place. Once upright, the mallet strikes again. Thud, thud. The wall grows stronger with every blow. A curious little observation from early colonial life suggests that building projects like this often brought settlers together in shared effort. Even those who normally worked on different tasks might gather to raise a wall or finish a roof before bad weather arrived. Community strength often came from these moments of cooperation. You glance toward the houses behind you. Smoke curls gently from the chimneys. Someone is preparing the evening meal. Children chase one another around a pile of firewood before being reminded by an adult to carry the sticks toward the storage shed instead. Life continues with its usual mixture of work and small moments of laughter. The defensive wall may represent caution, but the settlement itself still feels alive with ordinary human activity. As the sun lowers toward the trees, the workers pause to examine the progress of the palisade. The line of upright logs now stretches across nearly half the open side of the clearing. Tomorrow they will continue. Another row of wood, another layer of protection. You run your hand once more along the rough bark of the nearest log. Beyond it, the forest waits in shadow. Inside it, the settlement grows stronger day by day. And between those two worlds stands this simple wooden wall, built from sweat, caution, and the quiet hope that it may never truly need to prove its strength. As the sun begins its slow descent behind the forest, the clearing takes on a warm golden glow. Long shadows stretch across the ground, weaving between houses, wood piles, and the unfinished palisade. The air grows cooler again, but for a little while the light feels gentle and forgiving. Work begins to slow. Axes are set aside, tools are placed carefully against walls. The steady rhythm of hammering and chopping fades into softer sounds of conversation and footsteps. This is the rare hour when the settlement allows itself a moment of rest. You sit on a rough wooden bench near the cooking fire while several settlers gather nearby. Someone has placed a kettle above the flames, letting water heat slowly, while the last preparations for the evening meal take shape. A pot of stew simmers once again. The smell drifts across the clearing, blending with the scent of smoke and cool autumn air. Moments like this remind everyone that life cannot consist only of labour. People need small celebrations too. A well-established historical reality tells us that even in difficult frontier settlements, communities often pause to mark special occasions or simply enjoy a shared meal together. These gatherings helped strengthen relationships and offered brief relief from the relentless demands of survival. Tonight is not a formal celebration, but the mood feels lighter than usual. A man begins humming a quiet tune while sharpening a knife near the fire. The melody is simple and unfamiliar to you, though it carries the gentle rhythm of songs sung during long journeys. Another settler soon joins in with a few soft words. Music spreads slowly across the clearing like the warmth of the fire itself. A curious little cultural detail from early colonial life notes that settlers frequently brought traditional songs and stories with them across the ocean. These familiar pieces of home helped people feel connected to the places they had left behind. Even here, thousands of miles from England, those songs continue. You lean back slightly and listen. The wind moves softly through the trees beyond the settlement. Leaves rustle quietly in the branches, while the sky above shifts toward deeper shades of orange and pink. Nearby, several children sit on the ground playing a simple game with smooth stones gathered from the riverbank. They toss the stones gently into the air and try to catch them before they hit the ground. Laughter breaks out when someone misses. It feels good to hear that sound. Children laughing reminds everyone that life here is not only hardship. Another subject historians continue to explore involves how settlers balance strict social expectations with the human need for relaxation and joy. While some colonial communities enforce serious moral standards, moments of music storytelling and games still found their way into daily life. After all, people remain people wherever they live. The kettle above the fire begins to whistle softly as the water grows hotter. Someone pours the steaming liquid into small cups along with dried herbs to create a simple tea. The drink warms your hands when you hold the cup. Its taste is mild but comforting. Across the clearing, a group of settlers begins sharing stories about the long voyage across the Atlantic. One man describes a violent storm that nearly tore the sails from the ship. Another laughs while recalling how cramped the sleeping quarters have been below deck. The stories grow more animated with each retelling. Details stretch slightly. Storm waves that become top. Cabins become smaller, but the laughter remains genuine. You glance toward the forest edge where the newly built palisade stands silhouetted against the fading light. The sharpened logs cast thin shadows across the ground. Beyond them, the wilderness waits quietly. Inside of this ball, however, the colony feels briefly peaceful. The stew is finally served as darkness settles across the clearing. Wooden bowls pass from hand to hand. The food tastes familiar now, rich with herbs and slow-cooked beans. You eat slowly while listening to the fading songs and quiet conversations around the fire. Above the settlement, the sky deepens into twilight blue. The first stars begin appearing one by one between drifting clouds. The fire crackles gently. The forest whispers softly. And for a little while, the small colony at the edge of this vast continent allows itself something rare. A moment of simple contentment. The next day begins with a pale blue sky and a quiet feeling of anticipation drifting through the settlement. The air is cool but clear, and the forest surrounding the village seems unusually calm, as if the land itself is waiting for something to happen. You notice people gathering near the centre of the clearing earlier than usual. Word has spread that several visitors will soon arrive from nearby native communities. The relationship between the settlers and the Wampanoag has grown steadily since those first cautious meetings months ago. Now both sides sometimes share food information and occasional gatherings meant to strengthen their alliance. Today appears to be one of those occasions. You stand beside the cooking fires and watch as several settlers prepare larger pots than usual. Beans soak in warm water. Pieces of meat are cut carefully and added to simmering broth. A small pile of freshly gathered herbs waits to be stirred into the mixture. Food will be shared. A widely accepted historical reality tells us that a gathering between the Plymouth settlers and members of the Wampanoag Confederacy took place during the autumn of 1621. This event is often remembered today as the first Thanksgiving, though the people present likely viewed it simply as a harvest celebration and diplomatic meeting. The clearing slowly fills with movement. Children carry extra firewood to keep the cooking fires strong. Women arrange wooden bowls and cups along a long plank set across two barrels to create a makeshift table. Men check the palisade gate and clear a path leading into the village. Before long, figures appear along the forest edge. A group of Wampanoag men approaches the settlement at a calm, steady pace. Some carry bows slung across their shoulders. Others bring small bundles of food gathered from the surrounding land. At their centre walks Massasoit the sachem, who leads the Wampanoag Confederacy. The settlers step forward to greet them. No one raises their voice, no weapons are drawn. Instead, there are nods of acknowledgement and gestures of welcome as the visitors enter the clearing. The moment feels both cautious and hopeful. A curious detail from early accounts suggests that the gathering lasted several days rather than a single meal. Hunting games, shared meals, and diplomatic discussions likely filled much of that time. Today you witness the beginning of that shared experience. One of the Wampanoag men places several freshly caught fish beside the cooking fire. Another carries a basket filled with corn. These foods will join the stew already simmering in the settlers' pots. The exchange feels natural. Food becomes the language both communities understand. You watch as settlers and Wampanoag stand together near the fires. Conversation moves slowly because the languages are different, but some words are translated through individuals who have learned pieces of both tongues. Laughter occasionally breaks through the effort. Someone points toward the children playing with stones nearby. The children themselves seem less cautious than the adults. Soon they begin copying each other's games, tossing pebbles and running short races across the clearing. One topic that historians continue discussing involves the deeper purpose behind this gathering. Some scholars believe the event primarily celebrated the colony's first successful harvest. Others argue that strengthening the political alliance between the settlers and the Wampanoag held equal importance. Both explanations may hold truth. The shared meal continues throughout the afternoon. Stew is ladled into bowls. Roasted meat passes from hand to hand. Corn is prepared in several different ways, some taught by the native visitors who have grown it on this land for generations. The flavours feel new and surprising. You sit beside the fire eating slowly while watching the scene unfold around you. The forest stands quietly beyond the clearing. Smoke from the cooking fires drifts upward into the open sky. For a moment, the settlement feels larger than usual, not because the buildings have grown, but because two communities now share the same space. Another interesting cultural observation from early colonial life notes that such gatherings often involve displays of skill or friendly competition. Hunting demonstrations, running races or archery contests sometimes formed part of these events. Later in the afternoon, several Wampanoag men demonstrate their skill with bows near the forest edge. Their arrows strike the wooden target with impressive accuracy. Some settlers attempt to match their aim using muskets, though the loud crack of gunfire sends several birds scattering from nearby trees. Laughter follows. The competition remains friendly. As evening approaches, the fires burn lower, and the sky turns soft shades of gold and purple. Conversation slow. People sit comfortably beside the fading flames. The gathering may be remembered centuries later as a symbol of gratitude, but tonight it feels simpler than that. A shared meal, a moment of cooperation, two groups of people sitting together in a small clearing at the edge of a vast continent. And for a little while the future feels just slightly less uncertain. The morning after the gathering arrives quietly. The clearing feels calmer than it did the previous day, though faint traces of the celebration remain. Ash from the cooking fires forms pale circles in the grass. A few wooden bowls sit beside the washing basin waiting to be cleaned. The smell of roasted meat still lingers faintly in the cool air. You step outside and stretch while the sun climbs slowly above the forest. Most of the Wampanoag visitors have already returned to their villages. Their footprints remain pressed into the soft earth near the palisade gate, gradually fading as the morning breeze drifts across the clearing. Life in the colony returns quickly to its usual rhythm. Work begins again, but today your attention turns towards something often overlooked. The work inside the houses. You walk toward one of the shelters where the door stands open to the morning light. Inside, a woman kneels beside a wooden table grinding dried corn with a stone tool. The slow circular motion produces a steady scraping sound that fills the room. Grinding grain is not a quick task. A firmly established historical truth explains that much of the daily labour in early colonial households fell to women: cooking, cleaning, preparing clothing, caring for children, preserving food, and maintaining the home required constant effort. These responsibilities rarely appeared in official records, yet without them the colony could not function. You sit quietly near the wall while watching the grinding process. Corn kernels crack beneath the stone, gradually turning into coarse meal that will later be used for bread or porridge. The smell of ground corn mixes with the ever-present scent of smoke from the hearth. Nearby, another woman hangs freshly washed clothing beside the fire to dry. The damp fabric releases thin wisps of steam as warmth from the flames spreads through the room. Laundry here takes hours of careful work. Water must be heated. Clothes must be scrubbed and rinsed, then dried slowly near the fire to prevent freezing in the cold air outside. A fascinating small detail from early household accounts describes how some colonial women created simple soap using wood, ash, and animal fat. The mixture produced a basic cleaning substance that could be used for both laundry and washing dishes. It was not particularly fragrant, but it worked. You glance toward the hearth where a pot simmers gently. Inside it, herbs and vegetables cook slowly to create the midday meal. The fire requires constant attention. A small shift in the flames could easily burn the food or allow it to cool too quickly. Household work rarely pauses. Children move through the room carrying small tasks with them. One girl gathers kindling for the fire. Another boy helps fetch water from the stream outside. Even the youngest members of the settlement contribute when they can. One subject historians often explore involves the degree of independence colonial women experienced in frontier settlements. Some scholars argue that the challenges of survival required women to take on broader responsibilities than those typically expected in European society. Others suggest that traditional roles still shaped daily expectations. Both perspectives appear possible when observing life inside these homes. The tasks remain demanding, but the women performing them show skill and confidence developed through constant practice. You watch as the ground corn meal is poured carefully into a wooden bowl. A small amount of water is added and the mixture stirred into thick dough. Soon the dough will be flattened and placed near the hearth to cook into simple bread. The smell will soon fill the room. Outside, the sky grows brighter as the morning progresses. The sounds of chopping wood and hammering drift faintly through the doorway. Yet inside the house, the work continues with its own quiet rhythm. Grinding, stirring, washing, preparing. These tasks may not carry the drama of building walls or hunting in the forest, but they sustain every person in the settlement. Without warm meals, clean clothing and cared for children, the colony could not survive long enough to build anything else. You stand and step back toward the doorway. Sunlight spills across the floorboards, illuminating dust particles floating gently through the air. The forest beyond the clearing glows softly beneath the late morning light. Behind you, the steady work inside the house continues without interruption. Quiet labour, endless tasks, and the unseen effort that keeps this fragile community alive day after day. The sky changes its mood overnight. When morning arrives, heavy grey clouds stretch across the horizon, like a thick blanket covering the entire coast. The air feels restless. Even before the wind begins to rise, you can sense something shifting in the atmosphere. You step outside your shelter and look toward the ocean. The water appears darker than usual, its surface moving with a restless rhythm. Waves roll toward the shore more quickly than yesterday, breaking with deeper sounds that echo faintly through the clearing. Storm weather is approaching. A well-documented historical pattern shows that coastal New England often experiences sudden storms, especially during the colder months. These weather systems sweep in from the Atlantic with powerful winds and heavy rain that can quickly transform a calm shoreline into a dangerous place. The settlers know this. Already, people are moving through the village with renewed urgency. You watch as several men secure loose items beside the houses. Wooden crates are pushed closer to walls. Bundles of tools are carried inside before the rain can reach them. The wind begins slowly. At first, it feels like a gentle push against your coat. Then the gusts grow stronger. Branches sway overhead, releasing a shower of dry leaves that spiral through the air before landing across the clearing. You pull your hat lower as the breeze strengthens. A curious little weather observation recorded in colonial journals describes how settlers often learned to read small changes in the natural world before storms arrived. The direction of the wind, the colour of the sky, and the movement of birds all provided clues about incoming weather. Today the signs are unmistakable. The storm is coming quickly. You help carry several sacks of grain into one of the storage buildings recently completed near the centre of the settlement. The door creaks as it swings open, revealing rows of barrels and crates stacked carefully along the walls. Protecting food supplies during storms becomes a priority. Even a small amount of moisture could spoil valuable grain. Outside, the wind rises another dodgy. The forest begins to move. Tall trees sway with deep creaking sounds as the gusts push through their branches. Pine needles scatter across the ground. The smell of damp soil grows stronger as the first drops of rain begin tapping against the roofs. Soon the storm arrives fully. Rain falls steadily across the clearing, drumming against wood and earth with a constant rhythm. Water runs along the narrow paths between houses, turning the soil into soft mud beneath your boots. You hurry toward the nearest shelter as the rain grows heavier. Inside, the fire burns warmly while the storm roars outside. The sound of wind pressing against the wooden walls fills the room. Occasionally a stronger gust rattles the roof beams above your head. You sit beside the hearth listening. Storms like this remind everyone how fragile these buildings truly are. One subject historians often examine involves how early settlers improved their construction methods after surviving their first harsh winters. Many initial houses were built quickly, with limited experience leaving them vulnerable to strong wind and heavy rain. Over time, colonists adapted their designs to better withstand the local climate. For now, however, the structures must endure as best they can. The rain continues for hours. Water trickles beneath the door and gathers in small puddles near the walls. Someone places a cloth along the base of the doorway to slow the flow. A small but memorable detail from colonial accounts mentions how settlers sometimes passed long, stormy hours indoors, repairing tools, mending clothing, or sharing quiet stories while waiting for the weather to calm. Today follows that same pattern. One man sits near the fire, sharpening a knife with slow, careful strokes. Another repairs a loose boot sole using thick thread and a curved needle. Children huddle close to the warmth of the hearth while listening to the wind outside. You glance toward the small window opening cut into the wall. Rain streaks across the view beyond it, blurring the outline of the forest. The storm feels powerful, yet it also feels strangely comforting from inside the shelter. The fire crackles steadily, voices murmur quietly, and outside the rain continues its endless rhythm across the roofs of the settlement. Eventually the wind begins to weaken. The rain softens from a heavy roar into a gentle patter. The clouds slowly drift eastward toward the ocean once again. When you step outside later in the afternoon, the clearing glistens beneath fresh moisture. Leaves shine with droplets. The air smells clean and cool. Storms may test the strength of the colony, but today the settlement has endured, and tomorrow the sun will likely return again to dry the mud beneath your boots. The morning after the storm feels washed clean. Sunlight pours across the clearing in long golden beams that sparkle on the damp grass. Water droplets cling to every branch and fence post, reflecting the light like tiny mirrors scattered throughout the village. You step outside and take a slow breath. The air smells fresh and cool, carrying hints of pine from the forest and salt from the distant sea. After the heavy rain, the entire landscape feels quieter and calmer. But the storm has left its mark. Mud covers many of the narrow paths between the houses. Small puddles gather beside the woodpiles. Few loose branches lie scattered across the ground where the wind shook them free from the trees. You walk toward one of the houses and examine the roof. A few wooden shingles shifted slightly during the night, though. Thankfully none have blown away. The structure held firm. Early colonial homes often face these tests. A commonly recognized historical reality shows that many of the first houses built by settlers were simple structures designed quickly to provide immediate shelter. They were strong enough to endure ordinary weather, but storms often revealed weaknesses that required constant repair. Building homes in a new land meant learning through experience. You climb a short ladder, leaning against the side of the house, and gently adjust one of the loose shingles. The wood still feels damp beneath your fingers. When the piece settles back into place, it creates a satisfying solid sound. Below you, several settlers in sikters speck the walls of other buildings. Some pack fresh mud into cracks between logs where rain washed away the earlier mixture. Others carry new bundles of straw to strengthen the insulation around doorways. Maintenance becomes part of daily life. A small but interesting architectural detail from early colonial settlements describes how many houses used a technique called wattle and daub. Thin wooden branches were woven together to form a wall frame, then covered with a mixture of mud, clay and straw to create insulation against wind and cold. The method required frequent upkeep. Heavy rain or freezing temperatures could damage the outer layer, forcing settlers to repair it regularly. You climb down from the ladder and step back to look at the row of houses lining the clearing. They appear humble. Rough timber walls, low roofs, small windows that allow only limited light. Yet these homes provide protection from cold windstorms and the darkness of the forest beyond. That protection means everything. Nearby, a group of settlers begins clearing branches that fell during the storm. They drag the larger pieces toward the wood pile where they will eventually be cut into firewood. Nothing here goes to waste. Even storm debris becomes useful. You help carry a heavy branch across the clearing. Its bark scrapes against your gloves as you drag it over the damp ground. The work feels steady and familiar. One subject that scholars often discuss involves how colonial architecture gradually adapted to the challenges of North American weather. Early homes sometimes resembled European designs, but settlers soon adjusted their construction techniques to better handle stronger winds, deeper snow, and colder temperatures. Those lessons often came after storms like the one you just experienced. You walk toward the palisade wall where the logs stand darker now from the rain. Water drips slowly from their sharpened tops, forming tiny streams along the wood. Beyond the wall, the forest glistens beneath the sunlight. Birds return quickly after the storm. A robin lands on one of the fence posts, shaking droplets from its feathers, before hopping down to search the muddy ground for worms. The world feels alive again. A curious little observation from colonial life notes that storms often created opportunities for settlers to gather fallen wood or locate animal tracks revealed in the softened soil. Already you notice several deer prints near the forest edge. Fresh tracks. The animals must have moved through the clearing during the night while the rain fell. You follow the prints briefly before they disappear into thicker grass beyond the palisade. By midday, the clearing begins to dry under the strengthening sun. Smoke rises from cooking fires as the midday meal is prepared. Life returns fully to its usual rhythm. The houses stand firm. The tools come out again. Children run carefully along the muddy paths while adults resume the endless work of building and repairing. You pause once more beside the nearest house and run your hand across the rough wooden wall. This structure may look simple, but it represents countless hours of labour, learning and determination. Each beam, each roof board, each patch of mud sealing the walls. Together they form the fragile shelter that allows the colony to survive another season in this vast and unpredictable land. The clearing wakes slowly as beneath a pale morning sky. Thin sunlight filters through the treetops while a faint mist still clings to the damp grass left behind by yesterday's storm. The settlement feels calm again, though the forest surrounding it hums with quiet movement. You step outside the house and notice several shapes moving near the edge of the clearing. Animals. Not the large wild creatures that roam the deeper woods, but the smaller companions that have gradually begun sharing life inside the settlement. A chicken wanders across the muddy ground, pecking carefully at seeds scattered near the cooking fire. Its feathers puff slightly in the cool air as it scratches the soil with quick, determined motions. Nearby, a lean dog trots between the houses, nose close to the ground, as it searches for any forgotten scraps from the previous evening's meal. Animals quickly become part of daily colonial life. A well-supported historical observation tells us that livestock and domestic animals were essential for survival in early settlements. Chickens provided eggs, dogs helped guard the village and assist with hunting, and other animals gradually became part of the small agricultural systems forming around the colony. You crouch beside this chicken as it continues its careful search for food. The bird clucks softly, tilting its head from side to side while examining the ground. Its presence feels oddly comforting, a small sign that life here is becoming slightly more still. Across the clearing, a settler carries a wooden bucket toward a simple enclosure made from thin wooden stakes. Inside the fence, 2 goats shift restlessly while waiting for their morning feed. Their hooves tap against the damp earth. One stretches its neck curiously toward the bucket. A small but interesting detail recorded in early colonial accounts notes that livestock often travelled across the Atlantic aboard crowded ships alongside the settlers themselves. These animals endured the same difficult voyage packed into cramped spaces until the ships finally reached land. Their survival meant fresh milk, meat and labour once the colony began to grow. You watch as the goats eagerly begin eating grain poured into a shallow wooden trough. Their chewing creates a steady crunching sound that echoes softly against the quiet morning. The dog from earlier wanders closer and sits beside the fence tail, brushing gently against the grass. For a moment the scene feels almost peaceful. Yet life with animals in a frontier settlement also brings complications. Chickens sometimes wander into newly planted fields. Dogs bark during the night at every unfamiliar sound. Goats nibble on clothing hung out to dry if someone forgets to watch them carefully. Living alongside animals requires patience. One topic historians continue exploring involves how quickly early colonial communities developed small-scale animal husbandry after arriving in North America. Some scholars suggest livestock played a crucial role in stabilizing settlements by providing consistent food sources and materials such as wool or leather. Others point out that managing animals could be challenging during the earliest months when resources remained scarce. Watching the goats devour their morning grain, you can imagine both arguments making sense. Beyond the enclosure, the forest begins its own daily routine. A deer appears briefly between the trees before vanishing again into shadow. Birds hop along the branches above the palisade wall. Even the wind seems alive, moving gently through the leaves with a soft whispering sound. Back in the center of the settlement, several children chase the wandering chicken across the clearing. Their laughter echoes lightly through the air until an adult reminds them to leave the bird alone. The chicken escapes their pursuit and resumes its careful pecking near the woodpile. A quirky little observation occasionally mentioned in colonial writings describes how settlers sometimes gave simple names to animals living within the village. A reliable hunting dog or a particularly productive hen might become well known among the small community. Names help turn useful creatures into familiar companions. You stand and stretch while the sun climbs higher above the trees. Warm light begins drying the muddy ground left by the storm. Nearby, a woman collects several eggs from a small nesting box inside the chicken enclosure. She carries them carefully back toward the cooking fire where breakfast will soon be prepared. Fresh eggs feel like a luxury compared to the salted meats and dried grains that filled earlier meals. The dog follows her, hopefully tail wagging with quiet optimism. Life in the settlement may still feel uncertain, but the presence of animals adds a sense of rhythm to each day. Chickens scratching the soil, goats waiting for their feed, dogs watching the forest edge. These small companions share the space between wilderness and home, and slowly, together with the settlers themselves, they help transform this fragile clearing into something that resembles a living village. Evening arrives slowly over the settlement. The sky fades from pale blue into a soft wash of amber and lavender above the distant trees. Smoke drifts upward from the cooking fires, twisting gently through the still air before disappearing into the growing twilight. You sit beside one of the hearths while the day's work finally winds down. Axes rest against wooden walls. Buckets lean beside the well. The long hours of chopping, hauling and repairing have given way to a quieter rhythm that settles across the village like a deep breath after effort. This is the hour when stories begin. A widely recognised feature of early colonial life was the importance of oral storytelling. With no newspapers, radio or printed entertainment available in small frontier settlements, the evening fire often became the centre of shared conversation and memory. Stories carried news, humour, warnings and lessons. Tonight, the fire glows warmly in the centre of the room while several settlers gather around it. The flames flicker against the log walls, sending slow shadows drifting across the ceiling beams. Someone begins speaking about the voyage across the Atlantic. His voice carries a calm rhythm that suits the quiet evening. He describes the week spent crossing endless grey water, the creaking of the ship during storms, and the way the horizon seemed to stretch forever in every direction. You lean back against the wall while listening. The warmth of the fire seeps gently through your coat. Across the room, a child curls up beside a blanket, eyes wide while following every word of the story. A curious little historical detail, sometimes mentioned in personal letters from settlers, describes how sea voyages often became legendary experiences in the minds of those who survived them. Each retelling seemed to grow slightly more dramatic than the last. Storm waves rose higher, wind howled louder, cabins became even smaller and more crowded, yet the shared memory helped bond people who had endured the same journey. Another voice joins the conversation. This settler tells a story about the first days after arriving on the coast. He remembers the silence of the forest and the strange feeling of standing in a land that felt both beautiful and unfamiliar. Several listeners nod quietly. Everyone remembers that moment. One subject that historians sometimes examine involves how storytelling helped shape early colonial identity. Scholars suggest that repeated stories about voyages, storms, and early struggles gradually formed a shared narrative that united the settlers as a community. Stories became a way to explain who they were, and why they'd come so far. Outside the shelter, the forest settles into its own night. Nighttime sounds. An owl calls once from somewhere among the branches. Leaves rustle faintly as a breeze moves through the trees. Inside, the fire crackles gently while another story begins. This one is lighter. The teller laughs while describing a small accident during the building of one of the first houses. A log slipped from someone's hands and landed squarely in the mud, splashing several workers with thick brown soil from head to toe. The room fills with quiet laughter. Even the child beside the blanket giggles. Moments of humour feel valuable after long days of hard labour. A quirky little cultural observation from colonial life notes that storytelling often included playful exaggeration. The mud splash might grow deeper with each retelling. The unlucky worker might become increasingly dramatic in the story. Over time, these small moments turn into village legends. You glance toward the doorway where the sky has darkened into deep twilight. The first stars appear between drifting clouds above the forest canopy. The settlement outside grows quieter. Doors close softly. Fires burn lower as people prepare for sleep. Inside the shelter, the final story of the evening begins. This one speaks of England, of green hills and quiet village lanes, of church bells echoing across fields on Sunday mornings. The voice telling the story grows softer as memories settle into the room like gentle echoes from another world. You listen quietly while the fire slowly fades into glowing embers. Stories drift into silence. The wind outside whispers through the trees once more. And for a little while, the settlement rests beneath the vast sky of a new continent, carrying its memories and hopes forward into another quiet night. Morning light returns, gently spilling across the clearing in soft bands of gold. The fires from the night before have faded into grey ash, but thin threads of smoke still rise, where someone has already begun coaxing new flames into life. You step outside and notice something different in the air, a sense of attention. Several settlers stand near the shoreline looking toward the distant horizon. The ocean stretches wide beneath the bright sky, its surface rippling softly in the morning breeze. News sometimes arrives here in unexpected ways, not always by ship, sometimes by travellers. A widely recognised historical reality explains that the early colonies often depended on slow networks of communication. Letters carried across the Atlantic could take months to arrive. News from nearby settlements or native communities sometimes travelled by foot or small boat long before written reports appeared. Information moved slowly in this world, yet when it arrived, people listened carefully. You walk toward the small group near the beach. One man has just returned from a short journey along the coast. His boots are still damp with sand and seawater. As he speaks, others lean closer to hear his report. He describes a fishing camp several miles north where a handful of European traders have begun visiting the region more regularly. Their ships bring tools and cloth, and sometimes they exchange goods with native communities along the shoreline. Trade is slowly expanding. A curious historical note often mentioned in studies of early colonial life is how informal trade networks developed even before official trading systems were established. Small exchanges of tools, metal goods, furs, and food helped build connections between distant communities. In many cases, these exchanges began with simple curiosity. You watch the conversation unfold as the man explains what he saw. Several settlers nod thoughtfully. Trade could mean access to items that remain scarce in the village. Iron tools, bedtime tools, salt for preserving meat, perhaps even cloth or seeds from other regions. At the same time, trade requires caution. Trust must be built slow. You glance out across the ocean again. From this distance, the water looks calm and endless. The same sea that carried the settlers across the Atlantic continues linking them to a wider world beyond the forest. One subject historians still explore concerns how early trade relationships shaped the survival of young colonies. Some researchers argue that trading networks became essential for securing resources that could not be produced locally. Others suggest colonies initially struggled to establish reliable exchanges due to distance and cultural barriers. Both possibilities feel believable here. The settlement remains small. Its resources are limited. Connections beyond the clearing may become increasingly important. You turn and walk back toward the houses where the day's work has already begun. The sound of axes returns as settlers resume cutting wood near the forest edge. A woman carries a basket of dried herbs toward the cooking fire. Children help gather kindling from beneath the trees. Life continues as it always does, yet the conversation by the shore lingers in your thoughts. This village may feel isolated among endless forests and wide ocean waters, but it is not truly alone. Small threads connect it to other settlements, to trading ships, to distant towns scattered along the coastline. A small but charming detail occasionally mentioned in colonial letters describes how news sometimes travelled through unexpected messengers. Fishermen, travelling hunters, and native traders often carried bits of information between communities long before official letters arrived. In a world without rapid communication, every traveller became a messenger. You pause beside the woodpile and stack several fresh branches beside the growing pile. The work feels familiar. The smell of pine fills the air. Above you, the sky stretches wide and bright across the horizon. The colony continues its slow growth, house by house, field by field, story by story, and beyond the forest and ocean, a wider world continues moving as well. Even if its news arrives here only one traveller at a time, the afternoon sun hangs low above the forest, bathing the clearing in a warm, honey-coloured light. The village hums with the familiar sounds of work. Axes strike wood in steady rhythm. Voices drift between houses as people move from one task to another. Yet something new is happening today. A small group of settlers gathers near the palisade gate with travel packs slung over their shoulders. These men are preparing to leave the village for a longer journey into the surrounding land. Not merely an exploration walk this time, a true expansion. You stand nearby watching as they check their supplies. Each person carries dried food, a blanket, and simple tools. One man adjusts the strap of a musket resting against his back. Their goal is to search for suitable land beyond the immediate forest. Places where future homes or farms might one day stand. A well-supported historical understanding explains that early colonial settlements rarely remained confined to a single clearing for long. As communities stabilised, settlers gradually explored nearby rivers, valleys and coastlines, looking for fertile soil, reliable water sources and safe building locations. Expansion often began with small scouting journeys like this one. You walk beside the group as they move toward the gate. The palisade logs rise tall around the settlement, their sharpened tops glowing softly in the afternoon light. When the gate opens, the travellers step through and follow a narrow path leading into the forest. For a moment, you consider how different the world looks beyond that wooden wall. Inside the settlement, the sounds of human life fill the air. Outside, the forest quickly swallows those sounds. The travellers disappear between the trees one by one. Their footsteps fade across the carpet of fallen leaves. A small but interesting observation, sometimes noted in colonial diaries, describes how early explorers often relied on natural landmarks when navigating unfamiliar terrain. Large rivers, distinctive hills, or unusual rock formations helped travellers remember their routes through dense wilderness. Maps were rare. Memory became their compass. You remain standing near the gate long after the group has vanished from sight. Beyond the trees, the land stretches farther than anyone in the settlement truly knows. Rolling hills, hidden streams, open meadows waiting quietly beneath a canopy of branches. Somewhere out there, new villages may one day appear. One topic that historians frequently examine involves the speed at which early colonies expanded into surrounding lands. Some scholars suggest that growth happened cautiously at first due to limited population and resources. Others argue that settlers often pushed outward quickly in search of farmland and opportunity. Standing here, the slower path seems understandable. Every step away from the village increases risk, yet curiosity and hope often travel together. You turn back toward the clearing, where the rest of the settlement continues its work. Children run across the grass chasing a stray chicken, while adults carry bundles of wood toward the storage shed. Life inside the palisade remains steady, but the journey that just began will slowly change the colony's future. A curious little detail from early exploration accounts describes how travellers sometimes left small signs along their route to guide those who might follow later. A bent branch, a stack of stones, or a carved mark on a tree could signal a safe path through the forest. Invisible trails begin forming long before official roads appear. The afternoon grows quieter as the sun lowers toward the horizon. Long shadows stretch across the clearing, touching the walls of houses and the trunks of nearby trees. You walk slowly along the inside of the palisade, running your hand across the rough bark of the logs. Beyond them, the forest glows softly beneath the fading sunlight. Somewhere out there, the small group of explorers continues their journey. Each step they take expands the invisible boundaries of this fragile settlement. Each path they follow brings new possibilities closer. And though the village behind you remains small, the land surrounding it holds space for countless futures still waiting to unfold. The weeks begin to blend together in a steady rhythm. Morning fires are lit. Work spreads across the clearing. Evening meals gather people back toward the glow of the hearth. Slowly, almost without anyone noticing, the settlement begins to feel less temporary. You stand near the centre of the village one cool morning and realise how much has changed. The paths between houses are now clearly worn into the earth. Grass no longer grows where hundreds of footsteps pass each day. The woodpiles stand tall beside the homes, stacked carefully to prepare for the colder months ahead. What once looked like a fragile camp now resembles a true village. A widely accepted historical observation is that many early colonial settlements transform gradually through repetition rather than dramatic moments. The simple act of returning to the same task day after day slowly shaped the environment into something stable. Habit built permanence. You walk toward the small field where crops were planted earlier in the season. Thin green shoots now push through the soil, reaching upward toward the sunlight. Their leaves flutter lightly in the breeze. The sight brings quiet satisfaction. These plants represent the future, not just survival for the coming winter, but the promise of harvests in seasons yet to arrive. A small but charming seashell, sometimes mentioned in colonial letters, describes how settlers often celebrated the first visible growth of planted crops. Even a few green leaves breaking through the soil could feel like a powerful sign that the land might support them after all. You kneel beside one of the young plants and gently brush away a bit of loose soil from its base. The plant stands firm. Nearby, a fence built from thin wooden stakes protects the small field from wandering animals. Chickens wander nearby but cannot reach the tender shoots. The settlement has learned quickly. One topic historians continue examining involves the psychological shift settlers experienced once their communities began producing reliable food. Some scholars suggest that the first successful crops changed how colonists viewed the land. Instead of a hostile wilderness, it slowly became a place where life could grow. The transformation was both practical and emotional. You stand and walk back toward the houses. Several new buildings have appeared during the past weeks. A storage shed now stands beside the main path. Another small house has been completed near the palisade wall. The village expands quietly. Children chase each other across the clearing while adults repair tools or prepare firewood. The dog that patrols the village trots lazily past the cooking fire, glancing hopefully toward the pot hanging above the flames. Even the animals seem accustomed to the routines here. A curious little observation from early settlement records suggests that once a colony survived its first difficult months, the atmosphere within the community often shifted noticeably. Fear and uncertainty slowly gave way to cautious confidence. The settlers here still face many challenges, yet they have endured storms, sickness, hunger, and the vast silence of the surrounding forest. Each day that passes strengthens their belief that the village may truly last. You walk along the palisade wall again, looking out toward the forest where the explorers left several days earlier. Their path has already begun fading beneath fallen leaves and drifting soil. Soon new travellers will follow it. New homes may rise beyond the trees. The settlement is no longer just surviving, it is beginning to grow. Above the village, the sky stretches wide and bright. Clouds drift slowly across the horizon, while the wind carries the faint scent of the ocean inland. You listen to the sounds around you. Axes striking wood, children laughing, voices calling across the clearing. These ordinary sounds form the heartbeat of the young colony. They signal something important. Life here is becoming familiar. Routine has replaced panic, and the fragile experiment begun on this quiet shoreline has started to take root in the soil of a new continent. Another evening settles gently over the village. The sun drifts downwards and behind the forest, and the sky slowly turns soft shades of amber and rose. Smoke rises from the hearth fires in thin, quiet ribbons that dissolve into the cool air. The clearing feels calm in a way that would have been hard to imagine when you first arrived on this shore. You sit near the edge of the settlement and watch the final light touch the wooden walls of the houses. So much has changed. When you first stepped onto this land, the clearing held nothing but grass and uncertain hope. The forest stood close and silent. The ocean stretched endlessly behind you. Every sound, every shadow, every gust of wind seemed unfamiliar. Now the village feels with quiet rhythm. Children carry small bundles of firewood toward the houses. Someone stirs a pot over the evening fire. The dog wanders along the palisade, pausing occasionally to glance toward the trees. Life continues. A widely accepted historical understanding tells us that the survival of the Plymouth settlement during its earliest years depended on a fragile combination of cooperation, adaptation, and learning from the land itself. The colonists who remained after the first difficult winter slowly built routines that allowed the community to endure. Standing here now, you can see how those routines have taken shape. The houses offer shelter. The small fields promise future harvests. The paths across the clearing guide footsteps that no longer feel lost. Even the forest beyond the wall feels slightly less mysterious than it once did. You lean back and listen to the quiet sounds of the evening. wind moving through the leaves, firewood cracking softly in the flames, voices speaking calmly between houses. A curious little detail sometimes mentioned in early colonial accounts describes how settlers often measured time, not by clocks, but by familiar daily events. Sunrise meant work, evening fires meant rest. The changing seasons became the calendar guiding every decision. Life followed the rhythm of the land itself. One question historians still discuss involves how the settlers themselves viewed these early years once the colony became more stable. Some writings suggest they remembered the hardship clearly. Others hint that the struggle gradually transformed into a story of perseverance. Both memories existed side by side. You glance toward the forest one last time. Beyond the trees, the continent stretches farther than anyone here can truly imagine. Rivers, mountains, valleys, and countless forests lie waiting beyond the edge of what these settlers know. The future of this land will grow far beyond this small clearing, but tonight the village rests quietly. The fires burn low. The stars begin appearing one by one in the darkening sky, and you sit here breathing the cool evening air, aware of how far this fragile community has come. The story of life in America in 1620 is not only about struggle, it is also about about learning slowly how to live in a new world, about building homes where there were none, about planting seeds that may one day grow into something larger than anyone here can yet imagine. Now the night grows deeper. The voices fade. The last sparks drift upward from the fires before disappearing into the dark. And as you rest here beside the quiet village, the wind moves gently through the trees like a soft lullaby carried across the land. The houses stand calm beneath the stars. The forest watches peacefully, and the long story of this new settlement slowly settles into silence. Now the world grows softer. The fire beside you has nearly burned down to glowing embers, its warmth spreading in slow waves through the cool night air. The village rests quietly, doors are closed, blankets have been pulled close. The gentle rhythm of sleep has begun settling across the small cluster of homes. You remain seated for a moment longer listening. The forest no longer feels threatening. Instead, it whispers softly with the sound of wind moving through the branches. Somewhere far away, an owl calls once before the night returns to stillness again. The sky above is wide and deep, filled with quiet stars. It is easy now to imagine how many nights like this must have passed over the centuries before anyone built a house here. The land existed long before the settlers arrived, and it will continue long after their fires fade into memory. But tonight the clearing holds a small human story. People who crossed an ocean. People who faced cold winters, unfamiliar forests, and uncertain futures. People who slowly learned how to live in this new place. You take one final breath of the cool air. The smell of wood smoke drifts gently past, blending with the scent of pine and distant salt from the sea. Everything feels calm. Everything feels quiet. And as the last glow of the fire fades into darkness, the village sleeps peacefully beneath the endless sky. Sweet dreams.